This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Can I welcome members and officers here at City Hall and the public in the gallery or watching on the webcast for today's meeting of the GLA Oversight Committee. Please may I remind participants to turn your phones off or put them on silent, and can I also ask members to ensure that any electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones. Can I ask the clerk, Paul Goodchild, to confirm any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies for absence today from Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you. Moving on to declarations of interest, can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? Can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in specific items listed on the agenda? No? No? Thank you. Summary list of actions. I propose we defer this item until after our discussion on the Mayor's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Action Plan at item 5, in case Assembly members have any questions for the Chief Officer on outstanding actions. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Number 4, action taken under delegated authority. Can we note the recent action taken by the former chair of this committee under delegated authority in consultation with party group lead members, namely to agree the following: the letter to the Mayor of London and Councillor Georgina Gold, Chair of the London Councils, on COVID-19, London's recovery 3 years on, and the response from the Mayor of London and Chair of London Councils. The committee's report, GLA Group Pensions, and the response from the Fund Secretary, Transport for London Pension Fund, and the committee's response to the Chief Officer's consultation on proposed changes to the GLA establishment in the GLA's External Relations Department. Can we also note that we are still expecting a response to the committee's letter, and the letter at Appendix 6 refers to a response from the Executive Director of Strategy and Communications to a commitment from the meeting of the committee on the 2nd of February 2023. That was noting, by the way. Okay, moving on to item 5. We now move on to today's principal business, which is a question and answer session with the Deputy Mayor for Communities and Social Justice and other guests concerning the Mayor's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Annual Report. I'd like to welcome our guests who have joined us for discussion. Dr. Debbie Weeks-Bernard, Deputy Mayor for Communities and Social Justice. Jazz Bhogal, Assistant Director Health, Children and Young Londoners. Rupinder Parhar, Head of Equalities GLA. Kenny Bowie, Director of Strategy and MPS Oversight, Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. Mark Evers, Chief Customer Officer, Transport for London. And Spencer Sutcliff, Assistant Commissioner, Fire Stations and Central Operations, London Fire Brigade. Thank you all for joining us today. As we were made aware, and members have been told, the Deputy Mayor will have to leave us after an hour. So we'll kick straight off into questions to you, probably in that respect, Debbie. To what extent has the Mayor achieved the objectives of his 2018 EDI strategy, and is this clear from your report?
Thank you, Emma, for the question. So the Inclusive London Equality Strategy, published in 2018, had 39 objectives set out in them, and we do believe that on a huge number of those he has been able to make some really good achievements for Londoners, particularly those Londoners who have protected characteristics. And I want to heavily caveat what I'm about to say, obviously, by taking into consideration that the report covers a period in which there was a pandemic, and obviously towards the end of that period, the cost of living crisis, and that both of these things likely worsened a lot of the inequalities which the Mayor has been seeking to address through this strategy. So just a couple of notable achievements to make the committee aware of. In the light of both COVID and the cost of living crisis, a lot of the focus that the Mayor has, a lot of the achievements that I'd like to mention are in relation to helping Londoners to mitigate the impacts of the cost of living crisis, recognising that there are objectives which were included in that original strategy, which were very specifically looking at trying to tackle rising levels of child poverty, trying to help Londoners to feel less financially unstable or insecure. So one of those issues that I'd like to raise with the committee is the work that the Mayor has done in investing in London's advice sector, which has been an incredibly important way of trying to enable Londoners to be aware of their rights and entitlements. And just this year, he has invested around £5 million, which has enabled Londoners to gain an additional 5.7 million in income, and that's largely through the work of a wonderful series of advisors working across London's advice sector who have been making Londoners aware of welfare benefits that they might not have realised that they were entitled to, making them aware of their eligibilities for various pots of funding run by local authorities and by charitable organisations, and also importantly in the prevention of debt. An additional achievement to make committee aware of is obviously that aligned with this work has been the Mayor's work to try to tackle food insecurity. So you will be aware that he made a recent announcement that he will be investing £130 million to ensure that all children of primary school age have access to free school meals from September onwards as an emergency measure. We certainly believe that this will enable families to save around £440 per year, which will obviously help them significantly in mitigating some of the impacts of the current crisis. The final three that I will mention, and then I will stop. Obviously, the Mayor has been very clear that he wants to ensure that London is a city which is safer, greener, and more equal. And to that end, the work that he has done to fulfil his statutory responsibilities on enabling Londoners to have access to clean air through his ultra-low emission zones, which he started earlier in his term, and which he will be building on through the expansion that will be occurring later on this year, again is a way of trying to ensure that all those individuals who come from particular backgrounds who we know are more likely to be exposed to air pollution are able to breathe cleaner air. Final two. To mention, we know that the Mayor has also very clear in trying to ensure that individuals have access to accommodation which is affordable, and so he has recently exceeded a housing start target by building genuinely affordable homes, exceeding the 116,000 target which was set out for him by government. And then the final thing just to mention is that through the work he has done to support young people, the Young Londoners Fund, which was a £45 million investment, has enabled around 140,000 young people to have access to positive things to do, positive experiences in safe spaces, which we know enables them to have a good start in life and to fulfil their potential. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. Looking at the extent to which the Mayor's achieved the objectives, when I was looking through the scorecard, there were several areas that of concern that I felt, and I wondered if you would speak particularly to those, showing that the Mayor has not performed well and performance has worsened in housing affordability and accessibility, poverty, public transport use and hate crime. And I wondered if you could speak to those particular areas.
So on housing affordability, I know that the Mayor has obviously exceeded those targets that I've mentioned and has been very clear on ensuring that we have a renewed focus on council house building. So on affordability, I know that he has doubled or intends to double the target that he has set himself for council house building by ensuring that he builds around 20,000 new council homes by 2024. On hate crime, I would kindly, probably because he's here sat next to me, defer to Kenny on that particular issue. I know, and I think it's important to make this point, however, I do know that during the time that the Mayor has been in his role, we have seen hate crime increase, particularly for Jewish communities, and we know that anti-Semitism has been on the rise. And I think with regards to issues like that, there are certainly a rise in quite negative and divisive rhetoric, which we know exists externally in society. And whilst the Mayor does all he can to support those organisations who I know do incredibly important work in supporting many of the individuals who experience hate crime from a range of protected characteristics through the Gallup programme, that we have to be incredibly clear that there has been an increase in the ways in which people respond to individuals from a range of different protected characteristics, either physically and verbally or online. And I think that it's incredibly important for us to be acutely aware of trying to do all we can to tackle that divisive and negative rhetoric by, I guess, using our responsibilities as those of us who have public platforms to do all we can to be as inclusive and as welcoming as we possibly can. The other two were, could you just remind me?
Poverty and public transport use.
So on poverty, I think, and this will probably come to light in further questioning, the issue with regards to rising levels of child poverty, certainly in London, and London has got one of the highest rates of child poverty across the whole of the city, is that the best way to tackle rising levels of poverty is something that the Mayor cannot do on his own. We know that poverty is something which rises in relation to access to good work, access to affordable housing, access to a welfare state which provides a safety net for individuals who fall on difficult times. And whilst the Mayor has the responsibility for council housing, as I've mentioned before, and does all he can to ensure that people have access to housing that's affordable, he doesn't have responsibility for the welfare state.
So this is talking about the Mayor's objectives in relation to his equality strategy. So I think everybody on the committee accepts there's limitations to that, but if we just talk to his strategy, just because of time, I want to make sure that we focus
absolutely,
on what his area.
Absolutely, but I think it's incredibly clear that if we are trying to tackle a broad issue like poverty, we need to work in conjunction with a range of different stakeholders and organisations, including national government. It's going to be very difficult for the Mayor on his own, with his levers and areas of responsibility, to bring down levels of poverty within the scope of his remit. So the reason that I mentioned all of those things is because it will be nigh on impossible for the Mayor of London to reduce poverty by himself, frankly. And then, sorry,
public transport
forgive
use.
my.
So I just mean if we talk to what the Mayor's doing, just for the time, but public transport use.
Yes. So I know that, as I've mentioned before, we had a pandemic in which we know that ridership levels were down, and we know that there has been an ongoing issue with regards to the ability of the Mayor to land a sustainable and workable funding deal with government to enable Transport for London to provide the services that it provides. So again, I think I would point to a lot of the issues that he has had with regards to securing that deal, and many of the conditions which were imposed upon him in relation to be able to secure the deal that he did do. So again, I would attribute my answer to some of those external factors.
Thanks. Just remind, we are trying to look at the annual report and
Sure.
policies and aims and objectives within that, and how that's aiding the scorecard. Just to ask, why is that 2020 to 22 annual report continues not to include an assessment of the impact of the actions taken?
So I think there's two things to mention. The first is that, as I have mentioned before, that report covered a particular period in time. So it covered a period in time in which many of the areas of delivery which were set out in the original strategy had to be readapted and refocused. There were many programs which couldn't deliver in the way that they were originally set out because of subsequent lockdowns, because of having individuals and organisations needing to reorient the work that they had set out to deliver, largely because the pandemic made it nigh and impossible for them to deliver in the way that they had originally set out. So one of the things that has been incredibly clear is that with the way in which we monitor progress, particularly during that period, we have to take into clear consideration that for many organisations, many institutions, many of the teams who are working across the GLA, they would have had to do their work differently, which would have meant that the types of delivery scales that we would have anticipated or hoped that we would have been able to report against would have changed as a result of that. I think the second thing to point out is that we have been incredibly reflexive about the way in which we assess those objectives. I think it's fair to say, and just from the conversation that we were just having around poverty, for example, there were many objectives which were identified in that original strategy, which were very high level. So tackling child obesity, bringing down rates of child poverty, for example, addressing pay gaps. Sorry, I couldn't think of the word. And what we have, on reflection, done is tried to tie objectives more specifically to performance indicators and specific areas of work which can be conducted by GLA teams. And so the refreshed objectives reflect that, and the new strategy, once published, will also reflect that attempt to create a better way of assessing those objectives so that you as a committee can scrutinise them, we can scrutinise themselves, and can be held to account both by senior leaders as well as by Londoners themselves.
Thanks. And I think you were just rolling into my next question there, but how do you expect the Assembly to scrutinise delivery of the EDI strategy without that comprehensive assessment of the impact of the actions included in the annual report?
So, as I've mentioned,
how can we scrutinise today almost with what we have?
So you can scrutinise what you have and the report that you've been given by asking questions of me and others today, obviously. But as I've mentioned before, we are changing the way in which we monitor and measure and assess progress against the strategy. And I think it's really important to reflect that there are new areas of focus that have been developed as a result of some of the changes which happened during the 2 years that this period covers. There were new, different, innovative ways of doing work and tackling inequality. And so the new objectives have to reflect that. I think one of the things that we have certainly learned is that not only do we want to make sure that the way in which we note down and describe the work that we're seeking to do needs to be more easily accessible for everyone, including yourselves as well as Londoners, but also when thinking about issues as broad as equalities, we have to be adaptable and quite flexible, because there will be crises that happen which worsen inequalities and mean that we have to divert the way in which we seek to address them to better reflect what Londoners are experiencing on the ground.
Why are there inconsistencies in the approach to measuring performance against the objectives? For example, different reporting periods, incomplete reporting periods, and varying points of comparison.
Okay, so I'll answer this question in two ways. So firstly, I think, again, as I've mentioned before, there are inconsistencies or differences in reporting because the work had to change over that 2-year period. I think we have to reflect on the fact that because of the types of inequalities that people were experiencing during that 2-year period, so we had increased numbers of older people from particular minority ethnic backgrounds who were dying from COVID, who were experiencing heightened rates of infection. We had particular communities who were more likely to be working in sectors that were shut down during the lockdown, which meant that the types of initiatives that we were seeking to develop, which were set out in 2018, could not help them during that 2-year period because it wasn't something that we envisaged or saw or foresaw. And so what that has meant is that some of the commitments that were set out had to change. Some of the reporting periods obviously had to change because we had to be more flexible in enabling people to report at different stages because delivery was affected by COVID. And we also had to ensure that we were, thank you for that note, we also had to pause reporting because obviously during that period of time, many organisations that have responsibility for reporting against equality objectives were asked by the EHRC to pause reporting simply because of the kind of impact that COVID was having on communities at that time. The second thing, though, that I wanted to say is that when it comes to trying to do comparisons on these issues across groups, I think it's very fair to say that we have to recognise that different protected characteristics and different groups have different issues which are not similar across issues. So if we take policing, for example, and recognise that the sorts of experiences that different groups have and the sorts of requirements that they might have of the Met Police are incredibly different. We can't expect to have comparisons across different groups under a particular sector, and that works for policing, for health, for a range of different areas. And I think that it's probably not inadequate, but inappropriate, I think, in many instances, for us to try to report in exactly the same way for every single protected characteristic because of the sorts of experiences of the city that they have.
Okay, so to take the 2 points there, the COVID reporting which has changed, so you think going forward that won't be, those inconsistencies will be, there won't be a reason to have any inconsistent reporting then, so the COVID issu's gone, right, as we go forward?
So COVID completely messed a lot of stuff up.
So I appreciate your second point, but on the first point around the COVID inconsistencies, we'll see those disappear.
Hopefully, as long as there isn't another crisis that comes along and creates difficulties.
Yeah,
but yes, absolutely.
A second wave or third, fourth, fifth wave of COVID, I don't know. Aside. Do you think that that's an approach which is easily accessible and that Londoners understand when they're looking at your data?
I think, if I'm going to be completely honest, if Londoners are looking at the data that we are presenting, so say, for example, in the Equality Report, the sorts of things that Londoners will be looking for is to see how the Mayor is doing on issues that are important to them. So I think that Londoners who, for example, want to know whether or not the Mayor is building enough houses which are affordable for them, for their families, will look to the chapter 1 and to the objectives laid out there and see how many he has built or how many he has started. So I think for Londoners, the way in which we set it out, which ostensibly I know for those who want to try to track is difficult, but I think for Londoners, what is important for them is to see exactly what the Mayor is doing on particular sets of issues. I do, though, want to stress that the way in which we are going to track progress, and I think I might have mentioned that when I came to Oversight the last time, is going to be now more intricately tied up with the way in which we report on performance across the whole of the GLA, and that should make it easier for the committee and for interested organisations to be able to see exactly how well or indeed how poorly we're doing on particular objectives.
Thanks. I'm going to pass over to Assembly Member Cooper.
Can I just make it? Do you accept, therefore, it is very difficult for us, and our job is to scrutinise you, when there is incomplete reporting periods, different reporting periods, varying points of comparison? Do you accept that it's very, very difficult for us to do our job when there's all these inconsistencies?
I mean, on the answer that I gave to Emma, I think that there are some inconsistencies that will exist simply because of the nature of the type of work that we are doing and the types of communities that we are trying to support. So those inconsistencies particularly will likely remain. I think when it comes to those reporting periods that you've mentioned, a lot of those reporting periods were out of our hands. The external impact of COVID meant that it made it very difficult for us to be able to properly go back to teams and to organisations that we funded, because delivery was so difficult for them to do during that period.
Okay, I hear what you say. It is very disappointing, though. Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly Member Hall. Assembly Member Cooper.
Thanks. Hello, Debbie. Nice to see you again at the committee. Just to pick up the points that Susan and Emma were making, we're not equality, diversity, inclusion experts. We're also not data presentation experts. So in one sense, we're very representative of, I'm speaking for the entire committee here, I hope nobody is an expert in either of those fields, and I've just misrepresented them. But I mean, and we also understand some of the reasons why you're talking about flexibility in the previous period, but obviously it does help us if we are looking at things. For example, reporting over the same time period, so that there's 3-month chunks or 6-month chunks or annual chunks. I think it would make the performance information, and it's quite a complex array of data points that we're looking at. So if we could get that so that that is always the same, I think having that consistent would help us then digging into some of the other complexity. Could that happen?
So I think these are fair points. It is really important for you as a committee to be able to scrutinise the progress of the work. Absolutely. I think, you know, barring the unfortunate time period that we're referring to, we have taken on board certainly the need to ensure that progress is as clear as possible. So, for example, out of the pandemic came a new way of conducting our work, a new way of structuring our budget. Everything is done along missions and foundations now. The new objectives that we have published are now completely aligned with those missions and foundations. And what that means is that from the new financial year, so the first quarter of the financial year, you will be able to track where objectives are in relation to the different types of work that different teams across the GLA are conducting. So that will make it easier for you to scrutinise progress. It will make it easier for you to see where targets may not be being met for, and also see an explanation as to why that's happening. So that will change, and you should be able to see that going forward, because I know that the corporate reporting framework does come to the Assembly for your scrutiny. So I'm hoping
so long as everyone's using those same quarterly time frames, then obviously that would make it a lot easier. But you do bring me on to my next point, which relates to we found it difficult when we were trying to dig into the data to identify where there'd been areas of poor progress, and you seem to be saying that, I mean, I don't know, perhaps it's been something that you and your team have found easy to identify, but obviously the GLA is an incredibly complex organisation. So do you think that it is possible to improve on the way that the 2018 EDI strategy was presenting that data, so that areas where things are lagging behind can be more focused in on?
Yeah, so So the first thing that we've obviously done is we've reduced the number of objectives. 39 was an incredibly ambitious set of objectives, and we've reduced them down to 14, which should just in and of itself make it easier to understand what the issues are in the first instance. With the corporate reporting framework, what that does is it ostensibly gives every team the opportunity to set out what their targets are, what their performance indicators are, and the equality objectives, which are now aligned to each of those missions and foundations, will also sit alongside those. Those dashboards also include information as to where targets haven't been met. And there is also a section which enables every team to talk about, frankly, what have been the issues which might have prevented a target being met or might have meant that progress has been slower. So those dashboards enable us to hold ourselves to account, but also will probably and more likely enable all of you to hold the GLA more specifically to account.
So will those dashboards be available to us? I mean, one of the things that we wanted to know was, had you considered producing a performance scorecard? Because obviously that makes it very simple for us to track what's going on, and obviously using the typical red, amber, green, the RAG, so that you can see when you're 10% off your target. Is that going to be available?
So there is. So RAG ratings are available. Are included on our performance reporting dashboards. So those that come to you, you will be able to see our RAG ratings. We have red, amber, green also. So yeah.
Now, one of the ways that I like to look at the data is to go onto the data store, which I have my own views about the presentation there. And one of the issues for me, I'm a charity trustee, so I look at quarterly data for the quarter, April to June of this year. I want to compare it with the previous year. I might want to compare it with the previous year to that as well. So it's having those sort of comparators is really valuable for being able to track, you know, what's going on. However, and the data store I think is the front entry point for a lot of Londoners into looking at many different things, but definitely the EDI data, and the information on the data store website hasn't been updated for the EDI performance indicators since 2020, so that's now 3 years out of date. Why has that happened, and are we going to put that information back out there for Londoners and for us?
Yes, yes. So yeah, that's a really good question. So the data store, the EDI data store, that was set up obviously to sit alongside the 2018 strategy, and it included, importantly, publicly available information. So data produced by academics, by public bodies, by statisticians. I shall speak slower. So in 2020, the decision was made in the wake of COVID to have a data set which would enable us to be able to see how COVID was impacting upon Londoners. And so the COVID-19 resilience data set was established. And that included a specific section on EDI. It was called narrowing inequalities. And what that gave us the opportunity to do was to look specifically at how COVID was impacting upon particular communities. And that was important to enable us to make sure that our work was more targeted. So that was set up in 2020. The State of London report, which I'm not sure if you've seen, but the State of London report has also subsequently been produced, and that gives a very specific view on how various public policy areas are impacting upon all equality groups, so all of those with protected characteristics. So that has been produced annually. I believe that there is a new report coming out next month, which I would definitely recommend you take a look at. So that provides a statistical analysis of where we are on inequalities. What I will say, though, is that that site that you've mentioned, once the new strategy is published, we will we will start that again. We will ensure that those publicly available data sets are available to sit alongside the new, refreshed, slightly smaller set of objectives.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member. And Debbie, just to confirm, that was a commitment that the data store will be updated.
Yep.
Do you have a time frame that we can know?
I don't, but and I'm sure that this will be a question that you'll want to ask, which is that the strategy is being published next month, and once that is published, we will make sure we've got the right sorts of the right data sets to accompany it. So I don't have a time frame, but we can let you know once that is up and running. Thanks. Definitely.
And on that note, Assembly Member Russell, I think one of your questions may be answered first.
Thank you, Chair. That's one of my questions off the list. Just in terms of just how you use the performance trends to inform the work of your teams. So are you using the performance trends to inform the delivery of the EDI strategy? Mm-hmm. So, for example, are you allocating additional resources in areas where there's been limited progress, for instance? And can you give us some examples?
It's a good question. Okay, so the way in which, and I'll probably look at what has happened during the past 2 years. So the way in which COVID and cost of living has impacted upon particular communities has meant that we have refocused some of the attention on financial hardship work. And so that work will be reflected in the new objectives. And will be reflected in the narrative that will surround those objectives, which is due to be published. Alongside that, as an example, what we have also done is we've listened to stakeholders. So initially in the original report, we talked about the importance of tackling child poverty, and we talked about the importance of making sure that people have access to information on their rights and entitlements. We have had lots of conversations with migrant organisations, organisations representing minority ethnic communities, the Deaf and Disabled People's Organisations Forum that I chair. All of these are groups of individuals who've approached us and have said what they need the work to do is to specifically identify their greater propensity or their greater risk of poverty, and that needs to be reflected in the new strategy. So we have listened to them, and we've ensured that that's what will happen in work going forward. And we've already sort of started doing that work. So when I initially started talking about some of the work that we've done with the advice sector, what has been incredibly clear is that the individuals who are most at risk of poverty are the ones who are least likely to ask for help. They're least likely to go to a citizen's advice. They're least likely to see an advisor of any sort. And that has informed the work that we have done by placing advisors in faith organisations, in community centres, in food banks, etc. And that has helpfully increased the numbers of individuals who are from minority ethnic backgrounds, who are disabled, who are both younger and older, who are more likely to ask for help now because the person giving them advice is someone they know and trust, and they don't have to go too far to access it. So yes, we have definitely used the performance as well as, importantly, what happened over the past 2 years to reorient the work that we are doing to inform the new strategy.
Mm-hmm. So kind of, yes, sort of using your understanding of the of the people who are worst impacted by poverty to kind of make sure that you're using structures that are efficient at getting to those communities. In terms of resources, what level of resources have been used over this 20 to 22 period to deliver the EDI strategy?
So we have an equalities team of 8 people now. Rupinder's a new recruit. We have to be completely honest that we had some vacancies in that team over the period, and so we now have a full set of people. And the staffing bill for that group of individuals is around 370,000. 372,000. And what that importantly now enables us to do is to ensure that we do the refreshing of the strategy, but also this is a team who provides secretariats for a range of different areas of work. They provide the secretariat for the EDI advisory group that I chair for on behalf of the Mayor. They provide the secretariat for something called the Building a Fairer City Action Plan. These are very wordy things, but that's a piece of work which came out of the London Recovery Board, which is now the London Partnership Board, and they provide the secretariat for that. And they do all of the engagement work with all of the various stakeholders who I consult on a quarterly basis to make sure that the work that we do at the GLA is informed by those organisations and those communities who are most impacted by inequality. So that's the kind of ballpark figure for the resource.
Thank you. Now, we've had a useful sort of RAG rating produced by the scrutiny team, just looking at particular issues that have that are kind of, you know, where it's red, where there's need for attention, and that absolutely endorses the issue of poverty, with pensioner poverty appearing to be the worst, and child and working age poverty being at amber. But another area that really jumps out is hate crime, and I just wondered, is that somewhere where you are also putting resource? I mean, you've mentioned, you know, you've raised the issue of poverty. Is hate crime somewhere else that you're putting resource?
So I am going to pass over to Kenny, because the work on hate crime sits within MOPAC. They have the responsibility for addressing.
In which case, I'm probably treading on someone else's toes, so we'll leave that to when it comes up later in the meeting.
And thanks, Assembly Member. And this is probably just a good time to remind guests that we haven't forgotten you're here. We're very thankful you're here, but just because of the timings, we've had to slightly rearrange the way we're doing questions. So thank you for your patience, and you will come in shortly. And just a plea, Debbie, that I think we will be able to get for our questions to you if we can just be slightly brief on the...
I'll shut up, yeah.
Not in those words at all. Thank you for the answers you're giving. But in that vein, I'll move over to Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor, to what extent has the Mayor achieved the objectives of the A Great Place to Live chapter of the EDI strategy?
So that chapter... that's got 12 objectives in, which span house building, homelessness, I believe, regen, and air quality. So if I pick air quality, he has obviously, in the work that he's done to roll out the ultra-low emissions zones.
I know.
Has done an awful lot of work on that.
I know.
And we know that
Yes.
That has had a particularly
dreadful effect on a lot of people. But
beneficial impacts on particular
awful,
protected
awful
characteristics.
Yes. So a great place to live. So in general, has he achieved those objectives?
So yes, so he's done an awful lot of work on tackling homelessness. Homelessness figures are down. Certainly, they sit at around 8,000 in comparison to 11,000 the previous year. We do know, though, and you know, I think it's important to say that whilst they are down, we recognise that we are in the middle of a cost of living crisis, and we know that there is the potential for them to rise again. But he has done an awful lot of work on that. He's also done an awful lot of work in staying on that vein in recognising that a huge proportion of those who've been rough sleeping are non-UK nationals, and a lot of the work that we have sought to do has to combine work to get people off the streets with giving them immigration advice and welfare advice so that they can regularise their status if need be. He's also obviously done quite a lot of work on council house building, as I've mentioned, by exceeding the targets. He's delivered the London plan, so there's a number of different
the length of the list you give, I could give double in going in the other direction. The annual report does not include an overall assessment of the delivery of the objectives. So despite all the inconsistencies with measurables and timescales, how are you measuring whether the Mayor has achieved these objectives?
So I think, as I've mentioned before, we have this new process of tying the PIs more closely to a reduced number of objectives. I think with the objectives outlined in that particular chapter, what we have done is we have made sure that we are very clear where there have been successes, so some of the successes that I've mentioned already. But also, I think it's important to also mention that a lot of the work that we do on all of these issues, we don't do in isolation of London. So we do an awful lot of engagement with stakeholders who tell us whether or not they think that the Mayor is meeting his responsibilities in their view.
Okay, well, it'd be nice for us to be able to see exactly, and then we'd be assured. So what objectives has he not met? What are you most concerned about?
I think some of the challenges have been, so I'll pick two. So the first is in relation to, I'll talk about you, Les, because I can see that you're not happy about ULEZ and you.
No, not at all.
But certainly in relation to the scrappage scheme, one of the things that we have lobbied hard for is for government to give us additional monies to extend that fund. We know that government has given funding to cities outside of London, like Bristol and Manchester, and we know that that is one of the things that people have talked about routinely with us. So that has definitely been.
But what has he not managed to do within his own pocket of £20 billion a year? What has he not been able to achieve?
So one of the
without blaming anybody else, I mean, what are you most unhappy about that you could have fixed?
Air quality is one of those issues. The other issue will be in relation to house building. I think that we have to be incredibly clear that we are in an economic climate which has created a reduced confidence, certainly, in house builders and developers. Some of them are incredibly worried about rising interest rates. They recognise that that is preventing people from wanting to buy new homes. And so this has had an impact on targets on that particular issue. And I think what we really do need is some economic stability that will improve confidence in developers, improve confidence in house buyers and developers, so that work can continue.
We are in a housing crisis, we all know that. But in terms of the Delivering Warmer Homes programme, there's no assessment of performance in the report. So why is that, particularly given that there are some concerning trends? So,
I mean, that's alongside many of the other areas that we've mentioned before. We know that, as I've mentioned, what we've sought to do with the report is to indicate where there have been successes in relation to that work, so that Londoners can see that the Mayor is doing good work on issues that are important to them. I think in the wake of this cost of living crisis, we've been incredibly active in trying to do an awful lot of work on trying to ensure that people have the information that they need to make their homes more energy efficient. The Fuel Poverty Partnership, which I chair alongside the Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy, also meets regularly with various government departments as well as National Energy Action to focus attention on some of the issues which are important to Londoners around prepayment meters, for example, energy efficiency, warmer homes. So a lot of that work is being continuously monitored through that partnership.
Okay, some of the housing-related measures have worsened since the last annual report. Why is that the case, and what has the GLA done to focus resources on that particular issue since the trend was first identified?
So I think on house building I've mentioned what I think are some of the issues, and some of those issues are in relation to concerns that house builders and developers have, particularly around what the rise in interest rates will mean for the ability of people to want to buy homes, but also for costs which developers are having to pay. I think it's also worth noting that there have been a range of supply issues which we know have emerged through both COVID, but also the cost of living crisis, which also has had an impact on that particular area. So these are issues which I know are important. They are external often to this particular objective. They're external to the sector. They're issues that the sector themselves are concerned about. We think that there is an awful lot of work that still needs to be done to inspire confidence, and so a lot of that work does need to happen at a national level around trying to ensure that we have an economy that inspires confidence in the markets and in the sector.
Well, since the publication of the previous annual report, which covers the period 2019 to 20, it's emerged that the proportion of households satisfied with their tenure fell from 84% to 82%, and of those, just 62% of the private rented sector households were satisfied with their tenure. So do you agree that this is a sign that the Mayor is failing to provide appropriate homes for Londoners?
No, not at all. I think that when it comes to, so there's two issues. One is in relation to the private rented sector, which is an area that we know the Mayor doesn't have control over, and is one that he's very concerned that there needs to be some regulation in. We know it's a sector which does have huge numbers of individuals living within it who are either in poverty or at risk of poverty, and so there is a huge amount that needs to be done, particularly in that space, because the rents are so high, and we know that there are particular issues with regards to quality. I think with regards to homes which are under local authority control, the Mayor works very, very closely with boroughs on a lot of these issues around quality in council housing. We know that building more council homes which are affordable is the best way to try to tackle some of those issues that I've mentioned before in relation to the numbers of people in poverty in the private renting sector. But there is a lot of work obviously also that we are doing in conjunction with local authorities around issues of quality.
Okay, it is very disappointing. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. And I've had 2 indications for supplementaries, so hopefully we should be able to wrap up just in time for you to leave on time. So Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you. I wondered if you had any thoughts about the equality impacts of rent controls and controlling the levels of rents. It's something that the Mayor has called for, being given those powers on many occasions. And I think we know that there's an absolute crisis in London, not just in terms of supply, but also in people's ability to afford to rent, particularly, obviously, in the private sector. It's really hard to get hold of any kind of social rented these days. Do you think that would make an improvement?
Absolutely. I do think that there are too many people at the moment who are renting homes in the private rented sector who are on very low incomes or who, because of the amount that they spend on rent, are in low incomes because their wages are only just about covering the price of rents. We also know that the quality in that sector is variable, and I think your point about an equality impact is incredibly important, because those who are most likely to be living in the rental sector, they're not they are younger, yes. But we've also seen increasing numbers of older people who are still renting in that sector. And we also know that there are huge numbers of individuals from particular minority, ethnic and other backgrounds who are also in the private rented sector. And EQA, I think, on this is so important. It's one of the areas, unfortunately, the Mayor has no powers. He does routinely lobby and ask. He's asked for a rent freeze recently, for example. But because we know that this is a sector which houses often individuals for whom affording rent is a struggle, then I think, you know, there needs to be some kind of inquiry or assessment of how we can improve a sector on an equalities basis so that people who are currently living in those sectors have a better quality of life. So I think it's a good question, and I would support something like that.
Yes, either rent controls or the local housing allowance wasn't uplifted yet again, and of course it's now really insufficient when you come to somewhere like London where rents are so high. But I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member. I would be concerned if it's putting too much effort into rent controls, given no prospective government is at all looking at it. So it would be perhaps unwise to put too much effort in. Anyway, I've got Assembly Member Fortune and then Assembly Member Pigeon to come in, please.
Thank you very much. I'm aware of time. Just going back to the your introduction where you were reading out the list of items. There was one around the school meal programme, the £130 million school meal programme. I'm really interested in the decision-making process that happened with that. So first, were you involved in that decision-making process and that policy development?
Yes, I was.
Right. That's good. I mean, you should be. So, because it's quite a complex project to roll out, so when did negotiations start? When did you start having those conversations? And when were conversations started with schools? Because it's quite a lot for them to do to expand kitchens, get the appropriate, I was going to say hardware, but cutlery and stuff in, staffing over a year, getting temporary stuff. So when did that conversation start as to when it was rolled out?
So, so importantly, that conversation is ongoing. I think so. Before we announced that decision, we had conversations with local authorities, absolutely. Given that local authorities are the ones who have the responsibility for all of their schools, we know that they're having those conversations with schools. And so we're not having direct conversation with schools, we're having conversations with local authorities, have conversations with schools. But I do know that Jazz, is it okay to bring her in? I don't know, but she has been working very specifically on the Universal Free Schools programme, so could give more detail.
So it's more the timeline is what I'm looking for, Jazz. So when did that, and I get ongoing, but there must have been a time when somebody sat down and said, right, let's do this thing. Yeah. When did that start?
So the announcement on free school meals was made, as you know, 3 months ago. Yeah. And so we've been involving schools, not all schools certainly at the very beginning, but some schools mainly.
So when was the beginning?
Sorry?
When was the beginning? When did
the beginning, well, I think we, as the decision to bring in free school meals was made once we knew what the income would be. And so that was made very, very quickly before. So the decision was made to do this at very high level, so in a very broad sense, £130 million to be spent on free school meals.
So when was the policy development? When did it?
Policy development is ongoing.
So when did it? So when was there the first discussion to say, right, we might have some money coming up, so let's look at rolling out a school meal programme, and you know we'll get a decision once we've got the money confirmed. But when did that start?
So March.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
So because it's useful for us, especially for those of us who are involved in budget, to know when these conversations start, especially as sometimes these policies get announced and there hasn't been a clear direction of where the budget was going to come from before it arrives there. I wouldn't have asked about this, but you brought it up, Debbie, when we were talking about the 116,000 figure of the starts. So just for clarity, that's 116,000, including some of the numbers that were started with the previous mayor, because it goes back to 2015. I'm trying to get a definition of what a start is, and I wouldn't expect you to be able to give me that, because what I'm thinking is you've got a big plot of land, it's going to be 300, 400 units, you go up, you stick a shovel in it, that's 400 starts. And that gives you a false idea, because you can't, it's a bit of a cliche, but you can't live in a start. I went and had a look at some of the figures. Over the last 5 years, we got 23,000 starts, but 6,000 homes completed. So housing is really important in terms of EDI. It's really important in terms of social cohesion, etc. That could be better. But one of the concerns is, are you aware of how much right to buy back money is used in these figures?
I'm sorry, I'm not.
And that's fine.
I could get
So
that
are you aware of what it is, though? Are you aware of the?
Yes, I have heard of it. Yes, I'm aware of what it is.
Okay, so this is a pot of cash that people can use to buy existing properties and then transfer those or convert those existing properties to be properties that are available for affordable housing. So again, I think it's a bit loose to consider that a start. Would you agree with that?
More of an already.
No,
it's a conversion rather than a start.
No, I mean,
so a house that's purchased and brought into local authority control is a new building.
So on the definition of start, when you talked about the shovel, etc., I don't know what that is.
I mean, I've asked, but I haven't got. Yeah.
But I think the right to buy back, certainly from my perspective, has been incredibly useful because we've been able to commit to trying to house Ukrainian arrivals. It's one of the things that we have said that we would use the
I'm
right
not disputing that. I'm just saying, is it a start? So we've said 116,000 starts.
It feels like a start to
and
me.
it isn't,
I
because
mean,
we're including numbers that were before the mayor was here. And we're saying that of those starts, actually some of them already existed. So that number's going down. And then a law of unintended consequence, I think, is actually, there's over 1,000, I think running 1.5 off the top of my head, properties that were purchased by right to buy back. So what pressure does that put on the private rental market, which you quite rightly highlighted is under stresses as well? This is private rental, I think, properties being taken out of circulation, which has a pressure on prices, doesn't it?
So the only thing I would say is that I think it's a standard measure. And it sounds like a start to me, only because I know it's important for us to be able to say that there is the potential for this to become something in which somebody will be housed. But as far as I'm aware, it's a standard measure, and that's all I can say.
It might be important to count it because it counts towards the figures. I would humbly suggest, but I realise that's not you, but just to be aware that there could be pressure there on the private rented sector, and actually, what we want to do is we want to get houses built and we want to get people in them. If you've got 23,000 starts shovel in the ground, and that's only 6,000 units, that's not a great ratio. The last thing, the scrappage scheme you mentioned as well. What happens to the scrapped cars?
I don't know.
That's right.
I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries.
I'm sorry, I don't know.
Because if they're, I don't know. It's a question I've asked. If they're resold, then you're not improving air quality. You're distributing it somewhere else.
I'll just interrupt. We're not going to have We're not going to have members talking across to each other. But I do understand the point. If the car's being scrapped, it's scrapped in the middle of London and causing more emissions, and that is not helpful for air quality. So it is an important question to ask. What is happening with the
Yeah, so because we're talking about air quality.
Hang on, members. If you can, Assemblymember Baker, and Assemblymember, we're not going to talk across each other, but I will explain the point because I do see where Assemblymember Fortune is going. He's asking what happens with the scrap cars. If a vehicle was scrapped in a pollution hotspot, there are going to be certain emissions from that, and that is also going to play into the air quality strategy. So that is the point of it. So anyway, Assemblymember Pigeon and Debbie, I promise you can leave after this.
Yeah, I just want to follow on from that conversation, actually, we can pick up with you, Jazz. Do you want to just reflect on your answer about the free school meals decision? Because the decision was made in February. You just said that no conversations with anyone took place until February/March about that policy. Unlikely the Mayor would have allocated £130 million for a project with no work whatsoever done. So I'm assuming work started probably last autumn to come up with some options. The decision was made in February. Do you want to just reflect on what you said to us?
I think based on the specific question about schools, so as officers, our engagement with schools began in February, but the Mayor's office have been obviously working on this for a very long time. I think before the autumn last year, and certainly the reference that we've made in subsequent policy work to reports that have come out from PwC commissioned by the Centre for Urban Health. That report came out in October, and we were discussing what that report would look like well before then. Yeah,
so that's what I'm saying. So I think we would expect that. Many of us have run councils. We would expect work to be going on And the idea suddenly something miraculously happened in February doesn't feel real. So I think
Sorry, thank
you may
you
have been
very much.
taking a literal answer to that question, but I think that's helpful to get that proper context. I had wanted to ask you about air quality before you disappear off, Deputy Mayor. And one of the performance indicators measuring air quality, there's been no update since 2013 in the annual report. So why have you not put in more up-to-date data so we can put it into context? Because when you've been asked about stuff today, you've said, well, the Mayor's introduced this policy, the Mayor's done this. They may well have had an impact, but how do we know when you haven't given us an accurate figure? Is it that you just don't have that data, or you've chosen not to include it?
So thank you for the question. So we do have the data. So the in the report it makes a reference to 2013, which is when officers began to do the work on establishing the relationship between air pollution and inequality. There has been a report that's been published in 2021, and that does include 2019 data. And in the report, there is a reference that is made to the period between 2013 and 2019. So I know the objective that you're referring to. And that wording is referring to that report in 2021. There is some updated analysis that the team are working on, and that is being completed. So there will be some new data for you to be able to
When will
see.
that be coming out?
I'm not sure, but we can find out for you.
Clearly, I mean, whatever side of the argument you're on, this is useful in terms of this big debate about the ULEZ expanding, because obviously this is about the first phase of it, as it were, but expanding and actually knowing the impact decisions are having can help make an argument or not. So it should be out, what, in the next month or two?
So it should, I've been told it should be out soon, but I don't know exactly when, and I wouldn't like to say. But we can find out and get the a publication date to the committee.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And if you could send us the publication date, I think that would be extremely helpful. And if you wanted to take this opportunity to leave, you might want to do that as well. Thanks, Debbie. Moving on to a great place for young people, and Assembly Member Dr. Sahota.
Thank you, Chair. These questions are to Jazz about your area of responsibility of the great place for young people to live in. So the question is, to what extent has the Mayor achieved the objectives of the A Great Place for Young People chapter of the EDI strategy?
Thank you. Let me just get to the right bit of my briefing. Bear with me one moment. So this involves 5 objectives, in particular focused around the work that we needed to do around child poverty, and that's work that certainly the team has been working on, in particular relating to some of the benefits advice that families should be in receipt of, and affordability of housing, access to childcare, and making sure that the early years childcare provision sector is able to make that offer and make that provision, but also making sure families were aware where they might be in receipt of government support for free childcare places, supporting around low pay and so on, and in particular around working with London councils and boroughs themselves to think about how we're supporting childcare providers to really focus, childcare providers in schools to really work more closely with those lowest attaining groups of children, and thinking about reducing disparities and exclusions and so on. And some of the wider work around working with businesses and boroughs to make sure that the voluntary sector and so on are able to look at creating more opportunities for young people, especially thinking now about as they've with the specific focus around creating opportunities around the science and technology and engineering sectors, and looking at ways in which we can engage more young people in digital, cultural and creative sectors. I'll kind of kick off a bit more around the early years campaign. So the big key there was around supporting the early years sector, thinking about the way in which what we've identified is 37% of children live in poverty in London, and so to really support families, we wanted to open up the early years campaign, which raised awareness to access to early education. We established a number of early years hubs that enabled access, that enabled families to have somewhere to go to understand what they could get access to in terms of support, and making sure that that support was there and available to them. Then thinking around children and young people's health in particular, and health kind of particularly in the 0 to 5 age group. A healthy start in life is absolutely the biggest investment we can be making in children, and certainly the opportunity for them to engage in services is very much in the health and care sector up to the age of 5 in preschool. And certainly so the work that we've done with establishing and now running the Healthy Early Years London programme. It's a programme that now works with 13,000 childcare settings, and it's an award programme, but that really helps organisations, kind of early years settings, to think about how they're engaging, not just in kind of creating a better health curriculum, so teaching children about health practice, but also being that healthy environment that children need, particularly in those first few years. And that builds on the programme that has been long established around Healthy Schools London, and Healthy Schools.
I just want to get an idea, to what extent did you meet those objectives you set? That's what I'm really interested in, right? Is you're telling me what the objectives are, right? But I want to know, how much progress did you make on that, achieving those objectives?
Yeah, so 13,000 early years settings in London have achieved the Healthy Early Years Standard. We have the vast majority of schools engaged in Healthy Schools London, and that's kind of in excess of 85% of schools, primary schools, are part of the Healthy Schools London programme, and a growing number of schools are part of secondary schools, and now beginning to consider being piloted for a secondary school programme for healthy schools. And so that's kind of ongoing work, and we're actually looking at resetting, re-energising both those programmes so they're much better in line with Ofsted ratings that have come in now to ensure that that continues to happen. Those two programmes, though, focus very much on the in-school environment. And so super zones were rolled out. We'd set a target of 50 super zones by the end of this administration. We're actually now, there are 56 schools covered by super zones in London already. The final tranche of funding is just about to go out in June, so we'll be making the announcement on 21 new grants that will be going out across London, and those we anticipate will cover another at least 30 schools. So and these are all schools we've identified in some of our most deprived areas, so really thinking about the way in which those, so between Healthy Early Years and Healthy Schools London and super zones, we kind of are beginning to get towards dealing with that proportionate universalism that we talk about through the Health and Equalities Strategy.
And what are the challenges you faced in meeting these objectives?
Actually, during the pandemic was probably the biggest challenge in terms of the rollout of those programmes and the engagement of schools. It was less about schools disengaging or early year settings disengaging. It was more about being able to provide, and kind of we had to readjust and reset the programme so that we could operate in a virtual environment, and schools were having to now move to working virtually. So that posed a significant challenge in terms of the way in which those programmes would work. And I think the appetite for schools, we expected it to wane a little bit during the pandemic because we recognised that they would have other challenges. Actually, they found the Healthy Schools programme to be a really important anchor for families and for children. And around that, they would then add in some of those other healthy kind of environmental kind of support for families, in particular around ensuring children had access to physical activity, which we know is often very hard for children in more deprived environments, particularly if you lived in accommodation where you had no access to outside space and so on. How could they ensure their children were still keeping active and eating healthily? And the cost of living crisis has continued to make that eating healthily a real challenge for a lot of families. So actually the Free School Meals programme coming alongside will begin to help that. And the super zones work, obviously, that because that's very much an environmental issue. It's about the place that the school is in. Again, we found that there was a kind of a hiatus created because of the pandemic. So the pandemic and now the cost of living remain some of the biggest impacts. The other thing to say, particularly around older children and young adults, so our youth activities and our youth programmes, and I know there's a separate youth chapter, but some of that transition from secondary onwards, so thinking about kind of sixth form and early, late, kind of particularly focusing on those young people not in education, employment or training, actually those opportunities that they would normally then spring to, for example, apprenticeships or other forms of activity that we could then particularly kind of signpost young people to, those also began to wane because those sectors, those industries, particularly, for example, building or hospitality, those were sectors that really suffered as a result of the pandemic. So those, I'd say, were the biggest challenges.
But of course, childhood obesity still remains very high in London, and it's worse in the BMA children. Why is that? Why is London more child obesity greater in London than in the rest of the country? And also, why do the BMA children do worse?
Yeah, I think the breadth of inequality is one factor in that, but we have a much younger population in London. So statistically, and the gap in inequality, and also the greater concentration of black minority ethnic children in London compared to other parts of the country. All of those factors taken together will have an impact on that. And I think we just have a different kind of environment in which children are growing up in London. We have some of the poorest air quality, particularly in outer London. The children in those environments will have different access. And we know that air quality, and we know access to spaces and, you know, clean, open, clear, safe spaces is going to be a major factor in children's ability to be physically active. So all of those factors taken together, we understand some of the causes.
And also probably the cost of living crisis and the food.
And that would exacerbate it.
Yeah. And why has the educational attainment gap by ethnicity grown during the period of the EDI strategy?
Yeah, typically we found access to particularly kind of digital support. So almost every school went on to digital learning, access to digital tools to enable children access to learning varied hugely amongst different communities and different neighbourhoods and different schools. So that really had a massive factor. And then also just the ability for the families then to kind of come in and support their children in their learning. So we saw that a high proportion of people who needed to go out to leave home to work came from minority ethnic backgrounds than not. So that also added the fact that often these children were often children that weren't in environments, weren't with family environments where they could continue learning easily.
And of course, I mean, you spoke earlier on about the impact of the school meals policy. What impact do you think this will have on children in London? The mayor's policy of rolling out free school meals in primary schools.
Yeah. So the initiative is primarily an initiative in relation to cost of living, and so this is we estimate that it will save families £440 per child per year. And so often in Key Stage 2 it's quite possible that you'll have 2 kids, so that could be a particular benefit to some families. The wider, the question about it being a universal offer, I think is really interesting, and quite a lot of evidence already that is available internationally as well as in London. There are 5 boroughs already that have for a long time rolled out free school meals universally at sixth form. And of course we've had universal free school meals coverage for infants for many years now. That also already tells us that what we've seen in some of those schools, an increase or an improvement in attainment within a term, where children are getting a consistent meal a week every day at school. Behaviour improves. We see the wider school environment, attitudes and behaviours around food improve. So all of those things taken together are what we expect to see, what we anticipate seeing quite quickly. Wider cost-benefit analysis shows us, then, as I mentioned earlier, PwC published their cost-benefit analysis last year. They've worked out the wider long-term life benefits. So over 20 years, if England were to adopt universal free school meals for all children in state primary schools, we'd probably be looking at about a £41 billion return on investment. That would be the cost-benefit if we were looking at universal coverage for children. And that's a lifelong, so over 20 years we would see that kind of benefit.
And just finally, looking at the objective that you set yourself for London, how do we compare with the rest of the country on those objectives?
Specifically on
the performance objective that you had when you set yourself for London, right? Okay, in the EDI, how has London compared with the rest of the country?
Specifically on those EDI measures, yeah.
Yes.
So the comparators are difficult to define. Like you said, there are some comparators where we will have some of the. We begin with some of the poorest outcomes for some of our children in the country, and so those improvements are going to be hard to measure. So we'll still compare, as not as well as we'd like, but certainly on some factors. For example, in relation to some of our access to certain services, we'll see improvements there. Some of our referrals to services like dental caries, we actually have better outcomes in London than in other parts of the country. So there's a whole range of other metrics that we look at.
Is this data? I mean, is this data available easily to you?
Yep, there is data. I think with the Health Committee have sought this data, so we've provided this previously to the Health Committee, but happy to provide it here. It's the Public Health Outcomes Framework data for England, and there is a London level and also at borough level as well, so you could compare in a number of ways. Happy to share that information.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Just quickly, Jazz, I wonder if you could update us on that free school meals, whether there's any conversations, preparations to extend this to next year.
So we're looking at what sustainability would look like. So what are our different options? And so we're wanting to understand. We're gaining a very clear picture of what that means for now. And as Assembly Member Fortune said, there are some challenges with that, and so we know that those are things that we want to be working through. But looking at the sustainability of this, in particular on the impacts it will have on some of those things that we've mentioned already around attainment and so on, what would that begin to get us, and what's the value for doing that? So we want to be able to make sure that we fully understand what those potential benefits could be, and use that as a means to almost setting the business case for the future.
Okay, so we are actively looking at year 2, as it were.
We're actively looking at what year 2 could look like, but we obviously aren't able to commit to anything. There is no financial security there.
And are you also contemplating what transition looks like if you cannot commit to an additional funding? Because obviously then you've got, we've talked about the many positive benefits, which I think everyone agrees on, but of course then taking that away, are you looking also at the transition period if that is removed next year?
Yeah, I mean, for any kind of forward-looking plan, it would be negligent of us not to. So, of course, we are. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. And just to bring in Assembly Member Baker on the
Thank you. It's not for you, Jess, actually. There are some more questions, I believe, for you afterwards, but I've actually got a separate question before we start questions to the representative of dysfunctional bodies, just to sort of keep you on your toes. So I was just going to ask that, and thank you so much for attending and looking forward to the questions, but I was going to ask whether you all have direct responsibilities for EDI strategy, either the delivery of the mayors or the functional body delivery strategies in your job descriptions. Is that part of your role?
EDI is part of everybody's job description.
Yeah, well, it's part of everyone's everywhere, but you do know what I mean. Are you the senior person who has responsibility for that
delivery of the elements which relate to this? The majority of those objectives in Chapter 5 would fall within my ambit. The actual EDI strategy for MOPAC as an organisation is led by our head of HR, a lady called Kim Chudley.
And so is that then that EDI strategy is just internally focused?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's no strategy that crosses over internally, externally?
Well, so we have the police and crime plan, which brings EDI into each of the individual measures. We look at each of the individual protected characteristics across our outcomes framework.
Yeah, I'm just really aware I don't want to tread on the toes of anyone. I just want to get an understanding of how each functional body deals with the issue. So thank you. Mark.
So I'll go next. So within Transport for London, we sort of have separate areas of responsibility for ED&I when that relates to our own workforce, and that is led by our Chief People Officer, and then our Chief customer and strategy officer would look at the elements that are related to our customers and the services that we provide to Londoners, of which a reasonable amount sort of sits within my area of expertise.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So EDI is led by our People Services Directorate. I would say that the Togetherness strategy is the strategy that looks at the internal requirements, and then external facing is within our community risk management plan.
Okay, thanks. That's really useful, and certainly I think it's maybe something that all the functional bodies need to consider, whether it's being led at an appropriately senior level across the board. But there we are.
Thanks. And looking over to Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. This is to Jazz. Good afternoon, Jazz. To what extent has the Mayor achieved the objectives of the A Great Place to Work and Do Business chapter of the EDI Strategy?
Thank you very much. So there are, again, here five objectives, and much of the activity that's been delivered over the last while has been particularly in the areas of labour market, skills, and in particular support, kind of working with sectors as opposed to having direct responsibility for. And these are areas where some of the kind of the wider engagement we have with the business sector, and in particular through supporting the skills sector, and looking at how we drive up that workforce. So there's a range of areas where he's worked, and I think at a very high level, I think it's fair to say that there are a wider range of challenges, in particular, for example, around pay. So the range of pay that we see in London is broader than the rest of the country. A much larger proportion of Black, Asian, minority ethnic employees in its workforce. And given that we know Black and minority ethnic communities are less likely to work in higher paying jobs, that's adding to a significant, and that's kind of a phenomenon that we see across the country. Given the proportion of those people from those communities in London, we're going to see those pay gaps being wider still across the board. However, a number of employers are based in London for whom their pay gap has been a particular focus, and they've narrowed those quite well. But I think kind of for Londoners, I think there is a wider long-term challenge here. So I think a big part of this is about how do we deal with the structural barriers to employment, the structural changes that we need to see that enable communities from minority backgrounds in particular, but also other groups, particularly kind of making sure women are able to get back out to work, particularly in relation to childcare. And so childcare costs, we know, are rising. That's really kind of stopping women from getting back into the workplace. So there are a whole range of some of these challenges that we need to understand better and then also be able to respond to. The Mayor's making it easier, particularly for migrant Londoners, to be able to get access to work, including kind of making sure that people have access to English as a second language, skills and training and development, making sure that through our survey of Londoners, we've ensured that there are kind of Londoners who don't speak English as a first language. They're I think is 5 times more likely to have no qualifications compared to Londoners who are proficient in English. So making sure that we're skilling those people up in English, as well as then thinking about them getting back into the work market. The Good Work Standard that the number of employers now are signed up to include a range of standards that kind of create good, healthy working environments that are career progressive. And so looking at the ways in which we're applying the Good Work Standard with employers has been a really big part of how we're working with businesses in particular, but also the wider public sector. The Building a Fairer City plan, a plan that's developed particularly with the London Partnership Board for organisations to look at structural inequalities, and that's in particular I engage in that from the point of view of working with the NHS, for example, and they're one of the largest employers in London, and looking at how we're able to influence those partners around the table of the London Partnership Board to adopt major policies, like, for example, bringing in London Living Wage and some of those other kind of key kind of opportunities for really improving the offer to Londoners. And a skills roadmap for London has kind of helped adult education really to play its part in supporting Londoners on a road to kind of a path for work and meaningful work that gets them into employers that do meet those standards, for example, the Good Work Standard, they're inclusive organisations and so on.
Okay, thank you. I mean, you have touched on one of the areas, which is ethnicity, but the disability pay gap still remains quite high too. Have you identified that, and what are you doing about that?
Yeah, so the London's median disability pay gap is 14.2%, and that was at 2019. And so I think there's a kind of, I mean, there is unlawful discrimination going on in across a number of different organisations across London, all sorts of places, lots of employers and so on. And we know that the disability pay gap is caused by disabled people being disproportionately likely to work part-time and work in roles and environments where they're in low-pay, low-skilled roles. And I think there are huge challenges there to look at in terms of the employers and culture and attitudes amongst employers, but also about making sure that we're more inclusive in the skills development of people with disabilities. And I think there's also an element here around, again, those big structural challenges to access to work.
Okay, I think you've really answered my next question, but what sort of challenges do you find? Because obviously you're not in control of all the pay, most of it is in the private sector. How do you sort of engage with these people, and how do you encourage them? Because you haven't got any sticks, have you, really? You can only use persuasion. Or do you have any sticks?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is to lead by example. As an organisation, I think we can really begin to understand we're also an employer. We know what that looks like. We know what it means to really want to be an inclusive employer. We've also launched the No Wrong Door programme in partnership with London Boroughs and Job Centre Plus, so looking at what the incentives to engage some of these employers and partners and working with them through. I mean, they want a workforce. They want good people to come work for them. They've got to diversify what they identify as talent, and so thinking about what a talent pool can look like, and really thinking about what the asset is out there in our communities. And I think one of the things that I think a number of employers do quite often is they think of people that are difficult to employ as a problem, as opposed to we're just not very good at employing those people. And I think there is something there about, as organisations, we can really take a leadership role here and influence as to how we think we should be employing better. Yeah, so Rupinder can come in as the lead for this in the organisation.
Just to add, so our Building a Fairer City programme, yeah, I mean, you're right, we don't have a stick approach, but we prefer to go for the influencing and good practice approach. So Building a Fairer City is specifically targeted towards addressing structural inequalities across a range of domains, and one of them is labour market. So we're working with employers and others to kind of, including unions and local government bodies, to share good practice around pay gaps, structural inequalities in the workplace, and kind of setting a good standard across the city through that work as well.
Thank you. So the Mayor's always made a big thing, quite rightly, about London living wage. What percentage of London's 1.1 million businesses pay the London living wage? Do you know?
We can come back to you on that if we can't find it quickly in our notes. But
well, that's okay, if you like. So could I have the numbers of employees and employers as well as the percentage, please?
Yeah.
Okay, then finally, how have your interventions impacted child and other person poverty levels in London?
So some of them we've yet to see. So in terms of, for example, free school meals, we haven't started rolling that out yet in terms of the impact that will have on poverty levels and income. I think we are. Do we have any more analysis on the wider inequalities? So you mean in terms of the work aspects?
Yeah, well, you know, I didn't bring it up, but there is a lack of measurables, and you know, you probably are doing a lot of good work, but how do you measure what impact that good work is having? How do you identify that there are now fewer children in poverty, for instance. There are now more people having being paid the London living wage. How do you measure your interventions? How do you know how your interventions are working?
Yeah. So some things we can tell you now. We can come back to you with more to do with employment. So certainly from the adult education budget. In 2019, we'd supported around 500,000 Londoners to access skills in employment and training. And of those, in the latest...
Sorry, this one is about children and older person poverty levels.
Children and older people's poverty levels.
Yeah.
I can just speak to the measuring. So it was a point that Debbie made earlier, but obviously with the new quality objectives that were published in November, we're now integrating that into our corporate reporting. So we'll have tangible numbers that we can present to the Oversight Committee on the impact that the policies and the equality objectives have had on addressing poverty amongst a range of groups with protected characteristics.
So since 2019-20, it's emerged that child and older person poverty rates have risen. So what is the Mayor going to do to not just examine the impact of his own policies on the cost of living to Londoners, which we know will be severe, such as the ULEZ will have a massive impact on older people. What is he, and obviously he's increasing the council tax as well, or his section of it. What's he doing to, one, understand the impact that his policies are having, and what's he doing to mitigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, again, I'd speak to not only the equality objectives having corporate reporting measures built into them, but all of the work that we deliver across the GLA and City Hall is always being measured. So we have performance indicators for every single programme that we're delivering that shows not just the positive impact, but where we're falling short and what the outcome of that work has been. So I would refer you back to the corporate reporting framework for the GLA. And it's not just the equality objectives, but all of our work that we're measuring in line with that.
So for instance, introducing the ULEZ will have a negative impact and will be a massive cost on the local authorities. It will add to the local authorities' cost because most local authorities will have fleets that don't actually comply with the ULEZ. What work have you done to identify those costs?
I can't speak directly to ULEZ, but what I can obviously point to is the scrappage programme, which again Debbie spoke to earlier. While the Mayor has resourced that, there is he's identified an additional need for funding from central government that has been provided to other cities. I can certainly take that question away and direct it to colleagues that lead on ULEZ policy in terms of the work they're doing with councils.
Yeah, well, I can tell you that no inquiry has been made of councils as to what the cost will be to them, but I can tell you that my initial indication is it's going to cost each council somewhere in the region of £250,000. And I just think that there's a whole series of things here where the Mayor hasn't really understood the impact of what he's doing. But I think I'll leave it there, Chair, if that's okay.
Thanks very much. Both Rupinder and Jazz, was there anything from the discussion that you felt you wanted to add before we move on to questioning the other statutory bodies?
Could I just make an additional point about free school meals? And so this is an area where...
Is it going to be a fresh point? Just I feel like we've covered it a lot. Just
yes,
yeah,
on the basis that this is an area that the Mayor's lobbied has been lobbying national government on for some time, in excess of a year, and certainly looking at that. So I just wanted to kind of say, in response to Caroline's really helpful question earlier, this is a conversation we've been having at various, across a range of policy considerations, and alongside a range of other kind of opportunities and ideas and policy options to understand how we improve the health of children and reduce the burden on families. So this is just one of a number of different initiatives that we've been looking at, and part of a much bigger conversation that's actually being had nationally, and the role of public health. And we know the Faculty of Public Health and a number of other experts are lobbying in the same direction. So this is very much part of a wider conversation that's been happening, that the Mayor's been involved in and that we've been having here within the GLA. Thank you.
Sorry, Rupinder, thanks, Jazz. Rupinder, was there anything you wanted to add?
It may have been mentioned by Debbie earlier, but just to say that our equality strategy is imminent in terms of publication, and that will be sent to the Oversight Committee.
Thanks. I haven't seen any indications, further questions, so I think unless you would like to stay, if you would like to leave, then thank you very much. And Is that? On my first time chairing this meeting, people are scaring me, but I think it's okay, you can't leave. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Yeah, I mean, I just would point out, though, that we keep talking about scrappage scheme. Well, there was £110 million on the table in February and in January at the budget meeting, but the Mayor chose not to go ahead with that, so that would have doubled it. There we go. Thought I'd better get in my budget amendment there, otherwise I'll be told off. Right, let's have a look. I'm going to talk about transport. There's a surprise. Mark, let me come to you. OK, so the EDI strategy. To what extent has that actually prompted TfL to think about new actions, policies, initiatives to drive the strategic objectives forward? Or is it really these things were happening in any case and it just fits under those headings in the strategy?
Thank you for the question and thank you for the opportunity to talk today. There's a combination of both, to be honest. Clearly, issues of equality, diversity and inclusion have been important to TfL since its inception. And many of the things which we are working on, we've been working on for a long period of time. It's a journey. We're certainly not even halfway through that journey. There's a lot of consistency between the EDI strategy and many of the themes which appear within the Mayor's transport strategy, which I guess is the guiding strategy for transport for London. We have ensured that our own equality objectives are reflective of the Mayor's, and in terms of bringing that to life, we are soon to publish in the summer a couple of documents. Action on Inclusion, one document focused upon what we're doing within our organisation to tackle issues around equality, diversity and inclusion, and a second document aimed at explaining and sort of outlining what we're going to do as an organisation to tackle these issues for our customers as well. So certainly there is alignment between the two. There are certainly some new aspects that we are considering as part of that document, but equally large parts of the work have been core to the organisation for some time.
So TfL's role in delivering the strategy is really delivering the transport strategy and next versions of that, or strategies like you've just talked about, the two, one internal, one external inclusion reports you've got coming up.
Correct. There are within the Mayor's strategy to begin with. There were clearly sort of 5 objectives and a section where TfL was a principal player in delivering that, and we have looked at that carefully and have aligned our business plan and internal resources and upcoming strategies to help deliver that. Obviously, transport being such an intrinsic part of the way that people live in London does have a role to play in many other aspects as well. Obviously, we're a very large property owner, so we have an opportunity to work to provide additional housing and more affordable housing. Equally, the work that we are doing to provide additional transport infrastructure has the potential to unlock large parts of London and play a small but important role in helping to tackle many of the things which we've talked about earlier as well. So yes, we sort of contribute in other areas, but equally we've got very specific things which we are working on ourselves.
And to what extent do you feel the Mayor has achieved the objectives of the Getting Around chapter of the EDI strategy?
So I think that there are some very good examples of where we have made progress in all of those areas. Certainly when it comes to our work to make London's streets and public places more accessible, removing barriers to walking and cycling. There's been a significant increase in the number of kilometres of cycling infrastructure, a sort of trebling of that since sort of 2016. 1 in 5 Londoners are now within 400 metres of that sort of improved cycling infrastructure. We have launched various guidance documents to help local authorities and others to remove barriers for pedestrians when they're sort of thinking about the design of the public transport, of the public realm. We continue to provide a range of transport concessions so that transport within London remains affordable. We recognise that can be a really big barrier to Londoners accessing a variety of different opportunities, whether that's education, employment or access to health. So a lot of work done there around sort of keeping fares low, providing additional concessions, making sure that people are aware of those concessions, as well as introducing products such as the bus hopper fare. So I think significant work forward there. Inclusive design is something which is exceptionally important on the transport network. So much of our infrastructure has a very, very long lifespan. Obviously, the Tube celebrates its 160th anniversary this year. Lots of the network has been renewed since then, but core components of it remain sort of in place. And so I think we have a legacy to pass on to others as well. So the fact that we now have contributed to a design standard that looks at how neurodiversity can be incorporated into the public realm is sort of very important, and we continue to look at how we can strengthen our equality impact assessment process from the very beginning of projects right the way through to the end to make sure that that's in place. So I think lots of different examples of where great progress has been made, but I'll sort of come back to a lot more work to be done, and certainly you will sort of see in the summer when we publish the Action on Inclusion document, with respect to customers in particularly, an awful lot of work to be done around providing more accessible infrastructure to be more mindful of the very diverse needs of Londoners as well.
That's very helpful, and I'm sure digital exclusion will form part of that as well, because that's a growing issue. How do the results of consultations, the equality impact assessments, feed into your EDI work?
Listening to what our customers and stakeholder groups representing their requirements is an essential part of that process, and is where we need to start with any significant infrastructure project, but likewise any policy that we're looking to implement as well. And through our experience, the co-design of those projects is the way that you get to something which works best for everyone and is often more affordable and easier to sort of implement as well. So we have a great sort of stakeholder relations team that reach out to customers and stakeholder groups in a variety of different ways, recognising that actually being able to reach people within London can sometimes be exceptionally challenging. So that's why we have to have a combination of face-to-face stakeholder groups, an accessible online platform, the use of, I guess, sort of more mainstream and conventional media to make people aware of the consultations that we're doing, and then having a similar range of ways that people can make their views known to us as well, so that we've got a properly representative understanding of how our customers and stakeholder groups feel about what we're proposing, feel about the barriers to accessing transport within London, so that we can design something that works for them. After all, that's what we're here to do.
The TfL has been under huge financial pressure, and clearly officers across TfL have had to come up with creative ideas to save money, to cut costs. Lots of ideas have come forward over the last few years. We've currently got the one-day travel card consultation. We had the idea of going cashless on the tube. How do you and your team fit into that, and how to put forward the complexities of this and the impact on equality and diversity in all of those decisions, to make sure that a decision is made based on all the facts and the implications? So you might miss a mayoral target because if you implement that, but on the other hand you're balancing the books. It's big decisions.
Yeah, you're absolutely right to say that the last few years have been very challenging from a financial perspective, and that brings with it hard decisions and compromises and understanding that sometimes you can't do everything that you would like to do. So within my team, we have an insight function that goes out and asks our customers in a robust and representative way what they think about issues, where they see barriers, what they think about our proposals. We have an independent disability advisory group, sort of independent but paid group of people that bring both deep subject matter expertise but also lived experience that can help us to look at the strategic consequences of some of our proposals, but also provide very practical advice to around some of the things which we're considering doing. We engage extensively with stakeholder groups. You mentioned the the potential for digital exclusion. We've done a lot of good work with London Travel Watch to understand that. We don't have all the good ideas. Equally, we don't always see all the issues. And so I think listening to the things that come to you and being prepared to change your mind on things is critically important as well. And I don't think that many people would disagree that the example that you gave, the role of cash in society generally is moving in a certain direction. However, should it be that public transport lead the charge there, or actually are there very good reasons to continue to provide Londoners and people visiting London with the option of using cash when travelling? And an exceptionally good case was put forward. Our own research, when we looked into it in detail, backed that up, and we stepped away from something which we were looking at doing. So I think you said it. We have had to explore a number of different things in policy areas, and some of those areas we've proceeded with, noting those issues and looking at sensible mitigations to try to reduce that negative impact where one exists, or in some cases stepping away from it and actually looking elsewhere entirely.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you. And thanks, Mark. And it might have taken a while to talk, but now you're very much in demand of members. So first, Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair. So I just want to pick up on something you just mentioned in passing to Assembly Member Pidgeon, was the Action on Inclusion strategy, which has been due from TfL for quite some time now. I think it was initially trailed in 2019, and in February 2023, TfL said it was going to be launched soon. So I just wonder if you can provide an update on when.
Yeah. So this summer, and so I guess just to clarify, Action on Inclusion is a sort of an umbrella term that's referring to what we've now decided will be two separate documents. One looking at our own workforce and what we need to do as an organisation to ensure that we are a place that is representative of London and that people want to come and work at, because we probably respect that. That document was being discussed at a TfL board panel meeting, the Safety, Sustainability and HR panel just this morning, and will be published imminently. And then the second part of that is a Action on Inclusion customer-facing document, of which we have a very strong draft, which will be, which is sort of making its way through its sort of final stages and will be published in the summer. I don't have a specific date as yet, but both published imminently.
Thank you. That's really helpful, and much look forward to those being published. So my other question relates to the Getting Around chapter. One of the objectives is to ensure that inclusive design is an important principle in all new transport schemes and those where major renewal works are being done. So you will be aware of how important toilets are for an inclusive and accessible transport system. Don't laugh, everyone. This is a very important equalities issue. With 9 in 10 Londoners considering toilet availability before they make a journey, according to data from Age UK London. So I was really pleased to hear in January that London Underground has rewritten its requirements for projects to include stronger instructions around providing toilets in new station infrastructure. But these requirements still allow for brand new and expanded stations to fail to provide public toilets, despite the Assembly having unanimously called for public toilet provision in new TfL stations last September. So can you explain why that is, and are you comfortable with the impact that that has on the inclusivity of the network?
So I would agree with you absolutely that the provision of toilets on the public transport network is incredibly important and something which customers and stakeholder groups have told us about. There are some 400 toilets on the TfL transport estate, and personally I'm not comfortable with the standard of the existing toilet facilities, rather, let alone what we're doing to provide new infrastructure. It's a challenging issue. Lots of antisocial behaviour takes place in toilets. A bunch of it. And I know that you are very aware of the issues around this. So I think firstly, I would like to say that we have done a lot of work to understand what the existing facilities are like, what work needs to be done, to communicate to our customers where facilities are, when they're open, to work with our operational colleagues to make sure that they're in a fit state for people to use. That's notwithstanding the fact that we should do more when we consider new infrastructure on the network. Now, that runs a spectrum as well between sort of relatively minor upgrades to existing infrastructure, and you would all be very aware of the very constrained space that we have in a lot of places, which limits what we're physically able to do, and it's incredibly complex actually to put in toilet facilities that have the appropriate drainage, the water supply, everything else. Brand new infrastructure on sort of larger sites is something where I do think that we can do more, and we need to align that to our step-free access provision as well, to ensure that as we continue to expand and enhance the network, that we have better toilet provision. And so part of the feasibility study that has been committed to will look specifically at what we should be considering when it comes to new infrastructure on the network, what that needs to look like, but also critically important, not just at the toilet facilities, but what are the other elements of our customer proposition that are critical to have alongside that, so that we're providing a properly inclusive and accessible transport network.
It is a really important thing. I mean, it's absolutely shocking that the Bond Street Elizabeth Line station was built, it was a complete new build. They could have designed in toilets. I appreciate the design happened 20 odd years ago, or possibly even more. But we shouldn't ever be building new big stations like that without designing in toilets from the outset, because it does make such a difference to so many Londoners' lives and experience of getting around.
I think it comes back to a point I made earlier. We appreciate that infrastructure on the transport network has an exceptionally long lifespan, and so the legacy that we are leaving today will live on. So I think you make a good point, and it is one which we are seeking to address through the feasibility study. Thank
you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblymember Hall.
Thank you. We weren't laughing at you, Caroline. We all completely agree with you. Assemblymember Pigeon mentioned the one-day travel card consultation, but unfortunately the Mayor admitted in an interview recently that it is going to go. Now, if we want to get people out of their cars, it doesn't help if we worsen the options to buy tickets, does it?
I must admit, I'm not aware that a decision has been taken on the one-day travel card. Obviously, providing customers with options to undertake public transport is really important, and why it is great that we have Oyster, contactless, various concessionary products for people to keep on using public transport. We are looking at options around how to make savings across a variety of different places, and looking at the cost of using paper tickets, the cost of the payments that are made associated with rail cards is something which we're considering, but I wasn't aware that a decision had been taken at this stage.
Well, he accidentally said in an interview that it was going to stop. So we'll watch that space. Perhaps he'll change his mind. Again, well, let's all predetermine a decision like with the ULEZ. The Mayor's own integrated impact assessment for the expansion of the ULEZ highlights how disabled Londoners, elderly Londoners and carers would be mentally, physically and financially either harmed by the scheme or put at a greater disadvantage. So can you take this into account for the objectives in this chapter?
So the expansion of the low emission zone is one policy aimed at tackling issues of air quality, climate change and congestion. The integrated impacts assessment did exactly as you said, looked at where there were benefits. Equally, it looked at trying to identify where there were potential issues that needed to be mitigated as part of the introduction of that policy. And as I guess, what has led to a variety of different policies, whether that's the scrappage scheme that we spoke about earlier in the session, or sort of a grace period for individuals who qualify because of various either disabilities, low incomes, or sort of the need to sort of own various vehicles. So it's I think what we would certainly say is that the people, disadvantaged Londoners who are living in outer London, are at most risk from poor air quality. They are also the individuals who are less likely to own vehicles, and the introduction of the scheme is a targeted intervention to try to improve that.
That actually isn't correct. And I've just read out all the people that the EDI strategy should be looking after, and your own impact assessment. I've got lists here of what that assessment said. You must have read it. And it's really very, very bad. I'll give you a copy if you like.
I think I've got a copy of.
Yeah, I'm sure you have, and that's why some of us are so vexed about this. Can you tell me why walking and cycling are figures that are always put together? Because many of us, I'm certainly one, I can wander around, even walk, but I don't cycle, and yet the figures are always put together, and very often people do either or. Why are they not separated?
It's a good question. I guess they tend to fall within the area of active travel, and so I guess as a policy area they tend to sort of sit together. However, obviously the barriers to encouraging people to walk or cycle more are different. Our strategies to increase the number of people walking and cycling are different. I'm sure if there are specific questions that you have around numbers, I can come back to you on those figures.
The reason I ask is that they say walking and cycling is increasing. Now, if it's that cycling is particularly increasing, then that justifies the millions and millions of pounds that was put into cycling lanes. Just as an example, if it's actually walking that's increased, and certainly disadvantaged people that can't afford perhaps public transport or rest of it, they're going to be walking, then perhaps more funding should be put into that. But to keep putting the two together, I think skews what's going on. We don't know. We don't know.
Certainly provide to you separate figures because we have those. You
do have them. Excellent.
Yes. Yep. So we can certainly
provide
that.
Well, we can be asking for those. That will be really interesting for all of us. Thank you. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Mark, if you could provide the committee with those figures, and I didn't quite hear your wording around whether you said disadvantaged or lower income households in London, in outer London, were less likely to own a vehicle. But again, we haven't seen that data that would show that to be correct. So if you think you have that, if you send that to committee as well, that would also be helpful because the data we have shows that is not correct. Assembly Member Baker.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try and keep it brief, although it's a big area. So I want to just ask about the interaction of... so we've got some high-level objectives in the Mayor's strategy and a variety of points that TfL have delivered. And then, of course, we've been talking about a variety of other things, projects, initiatives, things that have got worse, that obviously really impact the accessibility and the inclusion of the transport network for Londoners. And that's a bit of a well, I'm not sure it is a head scratcher. I have my views about what it is, but so what I'm sort of wondering, what I'm going to ask you is, how can TfL better ensure that the decisions that they make do not have unintended consequences that put us backwards on some of these? For instance, Assemblymember Pigeon was, although the cashless proposals didn't go forward, I think anyone who had EDI quite high on their list of things they were responsible for would have looked at a cashless proposal and gone, whoa, hold on a minute, this is immediately going to impact a whole load of disadvantaged groups. And I am concerned that these things, while you're doing lots of very worthy things, and of course there's TfL's own equality strategy that has lots of very worthy isolated things, the overall direction sometimes seems to be going in the wrong direction and the right and against the Mayor's strategy, to be honest, overall. So I'm just wondering what TfL can do to ensure that happens less.
So I think this will be set out within the Action on Inclusion customer document. So I think that we would recognise that actually the evidence base isn't as good as what it could be. So our understanding in very granular detail of the diversity of London and sort of how that data set integrates into our transport planning models and everything else isn't as good as it could be. So we need to have that on hand. We need to have a more comprehensive measurement framework so that we can understand what are the things which we should be watching out for, things which we monitor on a constant basis so that we can readjust policies if we see things moving in the wrong direction. We have a quality impact assessment program. I think there is more that we can do to embed that properly into the way that we work every single day, and rather than it being something which is looked at for the largest projects, the most significant policy areas, that it is something sort of in the minds and in the culture of the organisation, so that every minor decision that's being made along the way thinks from that perspective as well. So I think a more systemic change in the way that we sort of look at these things will help to tackle that. And I think off the back of the Action on Inclusion document, we will have indicators that we will be able to put onto our TfL scorecard that guides the way that we work as an organisation, and is certainly monitored by our executive committee team and incentivises which direction they sort of take the organisation in strategically, but equally will be figures that we will publish alongside lots of data that we already publish to our board and publicly, so that people can scrutinise us and hold us to account. So I think that's able to do that.
Absolutely, yeah, and obviously we're part of that. Can I just ask, and apologies for not knowing the TfL's org chart inside out, but when you say the executive committee team, and I asked you earlier on who had responsibility at which level, who's got responsibility at the executive committee team for EDI overall?
So
is it the people
from
you mentioned
an internal
earlier?
perspective, it is our chief people officer, Fiona
Yeah.
Brunskill, and for from a customer perspective, it is Alex Williams.
That is what you said earlier on. Thank you. Do you think there's any impact on having those done separately? Do you not have any concerns that the diversity of the organisation, and by the way, this is not a criticism of any individual, but of an organisation as a whole, and certainly transport as a whole, that if it's less diverse, it less reflects the needs of Londoners? It's more likely there's no one in the room that goes, hold on a minute, this is a really terrible idea.
I think that you are right to say that a more diverse leadership team, a more diverse and representative organisation will take better decisions that are more reflective of the city that we are seeking to serve. And that's why there are initiatives within the organisation in order to try to ensure that at the most senior levels we have better representation, but that runs right the way through from the apprentice schemes that we run, trying to get more girls into STEM-related careers, whether that's looking at the ethnic diversity of people joining other types of apprenticeship schemes, whether that's looking at having anonymised CVs as part of the recruitment process. So there's an enormous amount of work being done to make sure that we are a more reflective organisation. We already are very reflective of what London is. So this is an improvement.
Overall, I worry in some rooms where decisions made, less so. I think that's the problem. I think overall TfL, absolutely. I'd better leave it there, otherwise I'll just talk for hours. Thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate that this is such a meaty subject, so there's been a lot of good conversation, but I appreciate your time as well, Mark, but perhaps if you did want to leave, feel free to do so now. And again, you're free to stay. And can I just start by thanking Kenny and Spencer for your great bouts of patience today, and now hopefully some questions to you from Susan Hall.
Yes, last but absolutely not least, my two favourite services, police and fire. So I feel sorry for Kenny. No, sorry, I should have waited till you'd left. I was on the Met line this morning, so do forgive me for being tetchy over transport. So, right, Kenny and Spencer. So I'll start off with you, Kenny. How has the EDI strategy influenced changes to your MOPAC's policy and projects over the last few years?
So I think my answer here will be very similar to the answer which Mark gave, which is a lot of what is in this strategy, as you would expect, aligns with what was already in the previous PCP, the current PCP, and reflects what came out of the Mayor's Action Plan. Possibly the main difference it led was trying to take a look at disproportionality on a much wider criminal justice style level, but they do broadly align, and I think it would be more of a problem if they didn't align, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I agree. Spencer?
Hello.
Same question.
I think, so our togetherness strategy was our internal strategy, but I think following the outcome report for the culture review in November, led by Nazir Asfel, I would say the recommendations for that and the current process around engage with His Majesty's Inspectorate is our absolute focus at the moment. So although that strategy is still running, our focus is on delivering our change programme and meeting those recommendations and working with the HMI and others to ensure we create a better place for our employees to work.
Okay, well, I'm with you. Is there any issue that you're particularly concerned with being able to deliver this?
Around the culture review?
Yeah, to do with the EDI.
It's a very, it's a very complex thing with many strands, and to solve it, we've got our survey that finished last week, and we had a really good participation rate of 70% for our plus 5,000 members. So I think that is going to give us a really good kind of base point to get a greater understanding of how our employees feel at work, how they're valued. We are having some good success with the external complaint service, over 250 complaints registered. So on the one hand, that sounds that's an alert, but on the other hand, people feel confident to ring in and be treated independently and fairly. I think it's early days. We have obviously spoke to this in other scrutiny committees, and hopefully we've shown our determination around this. So we have accepted all of the recommendations following the culture review, and naturally we are cautious but confident that we are going to deliver on them.
Okay, thank you. So Kenny, what are your main areas of concern regarding inequalities in policing and crime?
Well, so I think I would start there with
Tracy addition,
the Casey review, which obviously found institutional racism, homophobia and misogyny within the Metropolitan Police, and also found, I suppose, what you would call streaks of ableism in terms of the work when you look at the numbers for the Employment Tribunal. I won't rehash what we went over at Police and Crime Committee over this earlier, but clearly the work to do and tackle the culture within the Met, to raise standards, to look at violence against women and girls and children, and to really reset the frontline policing for London as a whole, is clearly very, very important, and it's clearly very important that the Metropolitan Police gets this right over the next few months. In terms of other things, I would just go on to, I think when you look at the objectives, you talked about hate crime. I think, Caroline, you get cut off asking, so I think there are mixed pictures in that. There's, for example, it has been an increasing trend for quite a while. The last year, actually, for the rolling 12 months, it is down roughly 9.9% to 24,226 offences, and it's actually down across everything other than on disability, all forms of hate crime other than disability crime, where it came in at exactly the same number of offences before. And people within their area who feel that hate crime is actually a problem has reduced by 28 percentage points over that 12-month period. Now, that may be down to methodological change in the way in which we do this with our public attitude survey, but the numbers themselves are quite sort of compelling that something has changed there. I would love to sit here and say to you that I understand why there's been that fall, and unfortunately we've just had those figures in, so we'll need to go away and do a bit more digging, but it does sort of paint a slightly more positive view of where we were. I mean, I could go on about stop and search figures. Depends where you want to go with all of this.
No, I'm sure anybody else will come in. So who's responsible for the EDI strategy?
So the internal EDI strategy is our Chief People Officer, but at board level it's sponsored by the CEO, Diana Lutchford.
Fine, okay, thank you. And Spencer, who's responsible for yours?
It rests with our Director of People Services, but we have a vacancy at the moment, so we have an interim in place.
Okay, all right then, thank you. I'll leave it there in case anybody else wants to come in.
Thank you. Assembly Member Russell.
I just wanted to come in briefly on the stop and search point, because in terms of EDI, the extent of the use of stop and search, but in particular the more intimate searches with intimate parts exposed, searches of children. Can you just set out what is happening to reduce the number of these searches, which are the most invasive and traumatic searches on children in London?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think overall, the numbers for overall stop and search are down something like 16% over the last 12 months, and I think 64% for MTIPs. I don't have the numbers to hand for the strip search within custody.
Could you perhaps send those on after the meeting? That would be really helpful.
Yes, I can send the link as well, so that it's easily accessible for everyone. So in terms of what's being done to reduce the numbers, I think first of all the most important thing to say is that there are some people who wish to sort of see these powers scrapped, and actually we don't think that's a sensible position. We do think that from a safeguarding perspective, if you were to get rid of these powers, what you would see is weapons or drugs or other horrible things being given to young children who are exploited. So we do think these powers are important, but they need to be used in a fair and proportionate way. In terms of getting the controls around this, we know that now the Metropolitan Police has increased the level at which one of these searches has to be authorised, which now rests at inspector level. We've seen that has led to a considerable decrease. We have seen that the work of the Gold Group set up by Lawrence Taylor, who reviews every one of these searches, which is done now, and actually identifies whether stuff has been done properly and feedbacks any learning. And I would pay tribute actually to the work of DCA Taylor on this. He has been very, very good. Has seen quite a considerable change, and they now do produce public dashboards in the Metropolitan Police, which we were pushing for in MOPAC, and again we discussed earlier, and the transparency around that and the numbers and the sort of focus that brings has, I think, been helpful in focusing minds about whether things are needed or not at a sort of strategic level.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think I can sit. Yes.
Thank you. I will be quick. I think everyone here is filled with admiration for what the blue light services do. You've got to, you're always, it's the old cliche, isn't it? Damned if you do, damned if you don't. And you're often making split-second decisions at the most difficult and pressurised time, and that is not easy, and that is respected. And at the same time, recognising that change has to be made, and that's been seen in the report. So for senior personnel like yourselves, driving that through the organisation is a real challenge, because you don't want to just go and beat everybody up and say you're all awful, because that has negative effects on morale as well. So two things, I guess. One is, what's changed in terms of the basic training, you call it from my background, but whatever, when you're going through Hendon or wherever, what's changed there when you're growing the firefighter or copper? And also, what does this look like on the ground? If I was to go and tap one of your junior officers and say, there's this change happening, you recognise the change, where would they say it would end up? What would, I don't want to say success look like, because you'll never get there, but what change would they expect to see?
So, just to clarify, I've got the utmost respect for the Blue Light Services as well. I'm not a member of one, I'm a member of MOPAC, but I agree with the sentiment that you've made. So, in terms of what has changed, there is community-led training now, which happens both in terms of stop and search for recruits, for new and older recruits actually, or people already in service, and that as well as training for people who are going out to boroughs or to BCUs in terms of exactly what is the local history, what are the complexities of this area, what is the makeup of it, and what do you need to be aware of. What does success look like if you tap somebody in the shoulder? I mean, I think the biggest success criteria there would be that there are certain Londoners who would be willing to tap a member of the police service on the shoulder in the first place. Would be a pretty big success criteria for them. And the second thing I would say about that is that people genuinely feel that neighbourhood policing has been rebuilt, is genuinely valued within the Met, and is making a difference to what local people see as being the local problems, rather than responding to what New Scotland Yard sees as the top priority or anybody else. It needs to be local police responding to local problems and making sort of people's local lives better at that sort of level. I think that's what success looks like.
So before I come to you then, Spence, I'll give you something to think about it. And you got the look of a copper, I have to say, Kenny.
I don't like that shifted.
It's a compliment. So in terms of that relationship with MOPAC then and frontline police officers, how do you pick up that feeling? What's the golden thread through to actually delivery as opposed to simply the strategic?
How do I pick up the thread of what's happening?
Yeah, there's the sense on the ground, yeah.
So visits is a good way of just going out and speaking to people. Quite often, the other thing is when you're hanging around here, you've got the mayor's protection officers. You can just have honestly, just some of the chat that you can pick up about what's going through the stuff. The other way that you can pick stuff up is actually if you're just walking down the street, just stop and it generally tends to startle them, but you can just stop and have a chat with the police, see what they're thinking about things. I mean, you have to do it transparently and explain I work for the mayor so that they give me their best answers. But yeah, there is ways of doing that. We're also looking to survey, this was a recommendation from the Harris Review, but we're looking to survey the firearms officers to see how they're doing. Obviously that's an area with the blue tickets which was particularly picked up in the Casey Review as having real issues around culture, so real value, and trying to get a little bit under the skin of all that. We look at the staff survey results and try and assess exactly where, and it's not just the response rates you look at, it's particular areas where there might not be response rates, and what that tells you about overall engagement of certain areas as well, because generally less engaged areas will actually have lower survey scores. So there's quite a few ways, but there's nothing, I don't think, which actually beats just going out and speaking to people.
It's an interesting specific point about the firearm response. Have you seen any fall off in recruitment towards that? Because I know anecdotally I heard there were some people that had concerns about.
So I don't think I couldn't give you off the top of my head, I'm afraid, the recruitment numbers. We haven't seen attrition go up, I don't think.
I mean, it's going away from this committee, so I recognise that. So Spencer.
Thank you. So we've done an awful lot since November. I'll just highlight a couple of bits. So myself, the Deputy Commissioner, my 4 area commanders, we made a commitment to visit all 412 of our watches. We're 360 in So a big task, but a very, very worthwhile task. So on the one hand, making it very, very clear our commitment to changing our culture, to having a zero tolerance around bullying, harassment, discrimination, but also naturally to listen to our staff and to see what will make the biggest difference to them. We have trained in inverted commas, we have had conversations with over 1,000 of our leaders, brought them in centrally in mixed groups and shared lived experience and how we can work together to improve the culture. We are looking to improve facilities for women on fire station, if we're talking about something really kind of functional and practical, and many other things that we are currently working on.
What about sort of your phase 1 training? How's that changed?
So recruits, trainees, there is a requirement now to ensure that they're at a level before they come in. So that's embedded actually in all our promotion processes going forward.
A level of what, sorry?
An EDI assessment,
okay, right.
To make sure that they're got a good enough understanding, certainly at that level, before they become an employee.
Okay, how does that manifest itself? Is it some psychometric testing? Or?
I can speak for the last assessment I undertook. Yeah. A number of role plays being assessed by EDI experts against a range of situations and circumstances. So mainly kind of role play and question based.
Did you lose a lot of people as a result of that?
I haven't got the figures for the different stages.
All right.
So what does success look like? For me, success is where all our staff at the end of this journey feel that they're winners. We haven't got winners and losers. I don't want a proportion of our employees winning out of this and people feel they're losing because, for example, everyone should see the difference when we have fairer, more transparent promotion processes, quicker, fairer, more transparent grievance processes, and so on. That's the success criteria for me around this. At some point, everyone will feel more valued, more heard at work, and more respected.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. And Spencer, on that, we were just talking to Assemblymember Fortune about, I don't know, you may not be able to provide figures of how many people you've lost because that might impede on some of the personal, but I'd be certainly interested, and I think the committee would, to see more details of how the results of that EDI strategy in terms of doing the role playing is playing out. So if you do have further information, we'd like to receive that.
We can arrange that, yes, we'll have the data.
Brilliant. And on that note, we've now reached the end of our question and answer session. So thank you to our guests, and thank you very much as well, Kenny and Spencer, for your patience today. And Kenny, I think you'll probably be having dreams of this chamber, won't you, tonight, or nightmares probably more accurately, but thank you very much for your time today at the GLA, both of you. The committee has some further business to deal with, but please feel free to leave the chamber if you have no further items on the agenda. Can I ask the committee to note the report as background to putting questions to the invited guests and note the subsequent discussion and and delegate authority to the chairman in consultation with the deputy chair and party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion. Thank you. Can I get a steer from members as to whether they would like a 5-minute adjournment or they just want to press ahead? Excellent. Can I return us back to item number 3, originally number 3 of your agenda pack, summary list of actions. I'd like to just open this up to discussion of members. We've had a number of items which we've had to wait a very long time for, and I know a number of preceding chairs to me have had to follow up quite robustly on information that's been outstanding. In fact, we only just received one item that was came from a request originally from the chair, not just before me, but before that even, which I think shows the concerns we have on this issue. And that information that we've received from that request, we found out is out of date in terms of deputy mayors' roles and job roles. So I wonder if, Mary, you wanted to say anything about how we improve this process, how we make sure the information we receive is the correct information, and then I'll open up to any other members.
Thank you. I'm showing as Kenny still, but obviously I'm not Kenny. That's just good.
And he's stuck to this place now.
So Chairman, you asked me a few days ago to pay some attention to this outstanding list, which I agree had been allowed to get too long. I have made some particular efforts over the last few days to try and clear as much as I can, and I know a lot has come through to the committee in the last few days. You're referring to some information today. I don't know about that. Not all of the information has come directly from me. It's come from the people that owe it to the committee. But we clearly need to find a way of making sure that this committee gets the information it asks for in a much more timely manner. And it's been interesting just pushing through some of these outstanding things over the last 7 or 8 days. And I think we can do much more to make sure that stuff is responded to in a timely manner. And I will take some responsibility for that, working with Helen. Helen and I have already had a conversation about that.
Thanks. Bring in Assembly Member Hall.
Mary, you know how cross I am about this. I have been asking for these JDs for months and months and months. My office have been contacting you. I've been asking you in leaders constantly. I've been told that they're going to be rewritten, and I've said, yes, that's fine, I want the old ones. I haven't been given the old ones. We've got some that have come through now. I'm not sure if they're old, I'm not sure if they're new. It's unacceptable. It is perfectly acceptable for Assembly members to ask what the job descriptions are of the deputy mayors. And here we are in May, and my office has been contacting you, or I have, since January. And you were constantly saying it'll be another week and be a couple of weeks. It's totally unacceptable.
So what I have been clear on is that the job descriptions for the deputy mayors are not mine to hand over. They're not my job descriptions. As we know, the deputy mayors are appointments of the mayor, and I have said in other forums as well that those will come to you from the Chief of Staff. Now, my understanding is that has very recently been delivered to you. If there are concerns about those job descriptions, those of the mayoral appointees, I'm afraid you need to address those to the Chief of Staff.
So, do you know any reason why we shouldn't have had them? You are the head of paid office service.
So I, as we know, they weren't on the website, which is part of what prompted your first request of me, Assembly Member Hall. My understanding is that they now are on the website. In fact, I did have a look myself first thing this morning and could see there are some. Those are what have been provided by the Chief of Staff, I think, as well in a letter, only yesterday or the day before. But if there are concerns about those job descriptions, I'm afraid those need to be addressed to the Chief of Staff.
Okay, so I'll ask you this as head of paid service. Do you think this is in any way acceptable?
I think what the mayoral administration does with the job descriptions of the mayoral appointees is for them to take a view on and decide. And And, as I said, my understanding is that those have now been published on the website.
So you don't think it's your responsibility to work on our behalf to try and get something that is, I mean, it's fair. It's a fair thing to ask for. It's not asking for something that should take long. They should be on the website anyway for the public to see. This is all public money. And if we can't ask you to deal with this, I think it's poor show. Do you think it's bad that they haven't given it to us?
Well, I've been asking on your behalf, and my understanding is that you now have them.
So do you think it's acceptable that we have had to wait this long? Do you think it's acceptable?
I'm afraid I don't have a view on that, as they weren't mine to give you.
You don't have a view?
But my understanding is that you now have them.
Months and months later, and you don't have a view. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I guess, Mary, I think the question perhaps is whether you're happy to see that we've waited, but I appreciate that you have made efforts in the last few days, and the substantial efforts I think you've gone to, I think probably go some way to answering Assembly Member Hall's questions about whether you thought it was acceptable or not. So thank you for the efforts you have made. And the point is taken that it's the Mayor's office that we need to take up the fact that we have received what appears to be out-of-date job descriptions. I can't see... Yeah.
Just quickly, and I think people watching this is the sort of complexity of the two-horse nature of this organisation, where you've got mayoral appointments with that direct line into the mayor, and then you've got civil service appointments, I guess it is. We may have it already. Can we get a job description for the night czar as well? Because I think that's another position that sort of sits in that bizarre middle role.
I have provided that one, because that was within my gift.
Okay.
And I provided
so that one is within your gift? Because
yes.
I think that's a key element. Brilliant.
Yes,
Thank
there are 13 mayoral appointments.
Yeah.
The night czar is not one of the 13.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I can't see any further hands, so can we note the completed ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of GLA Oversight Committee? Thank you. I think taking in mind the conversation we've had, and thank you for that, Mary. Moving on to State of London Debate 2023, I'd like to welcome our guests, or shall I say, Mary, thanks for staying on, and Nicole Valentinuzzi, thank you for joining us. Nicole's the Assistant Director of External Relations within the GLA. Did anyone have any questions? I'm going to take it as read that we are looking at this item and everyone's seen, so I'll pass over Assembly Member Pigeon.
You have asked in this report for further ways to improve the State of London debate. And I have been talking about this for a very long time, and it also links for me to People's Question Time. When are we going to do a thorough review of these evenings that we have to hold because they're set out in legislation? How do we make them truly inclusive and actually worthwhile for everyone attending? The State of London debate, as Len will recall, used to be a massive event at the QE2 on a Saturday that was completely inclusive to Londoners, with lots of workshops, with Assembly members on panels, different debates. The Mayor got to address everyone, but also real focus on areas. If you really wanted to talk about transport, you could go and you could be in a room and you could have your say and so on. It was a really super event. That then gradually got scrapped, and there were other events at the old City Hall. Again, Assembly members were really involved. Now it's become a sort of, worship the Mayor with some independent chair, and it's all on media, and now the deputy mayors are up there, and the Assembly, the other bit of the authority, is not involved at all. And actually, how inclusive is that really? It's not kind of workshopy, it's not whatever. And given the state of the police and fire services in London and the need to engage with Londoners, I wonder if there's an opportunity to do something different that isn't so celebrity-focused around the Mayor, and it's actually more about using it to get real thoughts from Londoners. And alongside that, I throw in every time People's Question Time. It's a really stale format. I don't know anyone who particularly enjoys it. I think the audience leave frustrated. I think members feel at times that they have spoken once in 2 hours. I had asked for a review of that. I don't know what's happening to that review. But actually, could we not do something there again where people come and you want to talk transport and environment, you're in that room with those lead members, the mayor can float round them all, but let's really have people coming along and leaving and feeling they've had a real say on what's happening in London. So that's my feedback, and I would like something really different and dynamic rather than the same old format we see every time.
Thank you for your feedback. This has been brought to my attention. I'm new in the role, and this is work that we're undertaking now.
Thanks, Nicole. Is that something that perhaps you said your new role that you'll be? Is that something you'll look at for the future State of London debate then, and perhaps can come back to this committee? Some of
Definitely.
Caroline's.
Yes, we are starting to scope it out now. I've been speaking to the Assembly Comms team as well, so hoping to have a progress report on where we are with that.
Thank you. Assembly Member Cooper.
Well, thank you very much for your very succinct reply. I think for those of us who were present at the Camden People's Question Time, which was seriously disrupted by one Mr. Pete Corbyn, and I'd like to thank our security staff for removing him and just people who were shouting about something that is actually nothing to do with the Greater London Authority. Vaccinations is not a programme that this authority has ever run. But the same Mr. P. Corbyn turned up outside along with a number of other individuals, some of whom appear to have banners with swastikas, and there was a vast police presence at the Ealing one, and there was quite a lot of shouting at the one in Redbridge in between. Now, you know, we have touched on this in our group meeting, and some of us have made some representations to Mary about this. So can I just be assured that your review is going to be of a very quick nature that informs how the next one, which I should imagine is due in November, is structured, so that we don't end up with and I have to say the last one I made quite a fuss about the idea that after we'd been on the platform that we were going to be escorted out through the audience, and in fact we weren't in the end. But it looked at one point as if we might have been, and that would have actually just been quite dangerous, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of many of us who were there. So is your review going to be speedy, and will it also take on board the viewpoints of those of us who were on the platform and had some delightful experiences at the last 3 People's Question Times, or perhaps not quite as delightful?
So the 2 issues are slightly separate but conjoined. We will be reviewing the format and how PQT and SOLD go forward in the future, but for the events that are happening very soon, we've already started to look at the security arrangements. So there's been an assessment with the security team here at looking at what are the principles that we're looking for with the venues we choose, the exit routes, all of that kind of thing. So my events team and the security team here are already, actually, I think they just did a site visit on Monday, and they're working through that.
Just think it's one of the ways of perhaps making it more welcoming, because it is quite distant in the way that it's set up, could then potentially lead to more risk, and I don't know how you balance that, which is why I mentioned that now, because I'm sure when you're looking at the format issues you'll be considering things like the shape of the stage and the actual staging elements of it, and I just want to be assured that safety, our safety, is a consideration of any of the elements of change of the format that you might be looking at.
Do you mind, Chairman, if I just come in for a moment just to reassure Assembly Member Cooper and others that, of course, we had quite a conversation about this at the last Oversight Committee when Helen and I were here together, and we are on a promise to come back on the specifics of PQT, second PQT of this year, to this committee with some details of some of the work that we've been doing and assurances around some of those issues. So Helen and Nicole and others are working specifically on that with some oversight from me as well.
Thank you.
So we'll be back to a committee.
I'm sure the Chair will make time for us to have a good discussion of that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Absolutely, thank you, Assembly Member. Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, and I echo all the points that have been made about, particularly by Assemblymember Pigeon, about format and kind of, welcome the fact that you're reviewing everything and thinking about how to do things differently. I just want to pick up on one point around security, because in the paper with this item, it talks about non-admittance to previously known protagonists. Now, that is slightly chilling from a human rights point of view. The idea that somehow people are going to be identified who have possibly protested about something in the past, or sort of made their views known about things. Now, I appreciate we don't, there will be people who want to come and protest at these kind of events who any one of us amongst here, myself included, may well not agree with. But the idea that because someone has raised particular views in the past, or has kind of protested in the past in a different context, might not be allowed admission to a democratic kind of accountability event, I think is worrying. So I just wonder what this previously known protagonists, how they are going to be identified, and what the safeguards are to ensure that people are treated fairly.
So my understanding is that the O2 is a professional venue with their security outfit. We have our security outfit as well, working with the police. They'll be working together to understand who from our registration list might be a known protagonist. I can try to find a better definition of known protagonists. Exactly.
Yes, what exactly is a protagonist?
Exactly.
Because I think, what we saw with the policing of the coronation just recently was people being arrested, people thinking they were picked up by facial recognition because they had previously been on a demonstration. So we do need to know what we need to know what a protagonist is. So who's on your watch list of who you're going to be checking for coming into the venue. And, they may well be people who I agree with or not, but I do think we need to be absolutely clear on what that piece of security involves.
Okay, I can supply some further information on that.
Thank you.
I think we ought to be clear about what do we mean by protagonist. In this case, I think it means someone who's aggressive to people, who's not cooperative if they're shouting and disrupting an event and being asked to leave. That's, I think, the inkling. But I don't think it's unfair for officers to be asked to go away and make up their own mind. I think we have to stretch that out. I don't believe anyone should be aggressive to others, including people around them, just because of their point of view. And they shouldn't be disrupting or stopping events taking place, which is what we've seen and occurred. So I think there's a line there. The fact that someone's been on a protest, I don't think will be the testing line of it. I understand your concerns, but I think we should be clear to officers what our principal concerns are. It's dangers or threats to others, and it's about behaviour. And it's about behaviour in a group. And if you shout and disrupt and don't follow the advice of a chair when asked politely or given the appropriate warnings, then I think it's fair for us to ban you.
If we have people not following the advice of chairs banned, we might lose a few assembly members, though. Assembly members myself included. Sorry, I was just going to say.
Sorry, can I just confirm? I mean, obviously, people being disruptive or particularly being violent or aggressive is obviously a case for concern. But I do think that there are civil liberties issues around creating lists of protagonists, and we just need to make sure we've got the safeguards in place.
If we can wrap this up, I think this comes down to the road protagonist, right? Protagonist to me kind of means the lead character of something. It doesn't necessarily mean, we need to, I think, define and round out what that means, perhaps that can be something that comes back to
Chair,
the
I don't
committee.
wish to prolong it, but there are certain circumstances where information may be given to us by others that still represents a threat to individuals. And if there is that knowledge held by the police, I wouldn't wish that to be held back. I don't think it's the issues that you're concerned at as in attendance of a protest. We're talking about other activities that people do engage in, which is a threat to others. And, virtually there's some hate material around that. If there is proper due process for it and it's been collected properly and appropriately, then it should be used. And it should be used. We can't have people who have a history of disruption or threats to others to think that there is not going to be some process, whether it may be legal, as in it comes to the attention of the police, as in, I'm not saying the protesters on the day of the coronation, but there were characters that could have been a potential threat. They may not have been part of the protest. We don't know that. We don't know that.
I think
you don't know that. I don't know that.
I think if we wrap this, I think where we have agreement is that the use of the word protagonist leaves some room for exploration of what that may mean. Where we may differ is on how much that should be enforced, but I think that's a question for another day. In the first instance, if we can get some feedback on what that means, then that would be good. So if you could provide us with that information, I think that would be helpful. And I think some wording different to known protagonists is probably worth using. Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you. A couple of things. Can we put leaflets on the chairs?
I am not entirely sure. I can come back to you on that.
Well, yes, please, because we've always been told we can't. And then, shock horror, there's leaflets all about ULEZ at the last People's Question time, and what a simply wonderful thing it was. So I'd really love to put leaflets on explaining just how much everybody hates it. So if we could have an answer to, can we put leaflets on the chairs? If the answer comes back no, then my next question, Mary, you must brace yourself, is why has the Mayor's team been allowed to put leaflets on chairs if the rest of us can't? Okay, so if you could get back to us relatively quickly on that. The other thing is an independent chair. Can you define independent?
I believe the chair has been confirmed as James O'Brien.
Independent? James O'Brien? Hello? Oh my goodness.
Sorry.
Right,
Sorry, Assembly members, I know it is getting to the end of the day and we may have other things to do, but if I could pick up on the point, and I heard some people saying Boris used to have Nick Ferrari, I think the point being, the question is, what is independent? And that remains whoever the Mayor of the day is. So what is independent?
Well, let me tell you now, James O'Brien is absolutely not independent. I think he is about the only one left that likes the Mayor, I'll give you that much, but he's certainly not independent. That is shocking, absolutely shocking. 10 deputy mayors, are they all going to be attending?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, and has any other venue been considered that's easier to access from other areas of London? Because some of us know just how dreadful it is to get here.
I am not entirely sure if other venues were how many other venues were considered at the outset of this.
Okay, all right, thanks very much.
I think so. Just to bring it back, like I said, I know members getting excited at the end of the day, but I do think that the fair question within that is how is independency defined? So.
Yeah,
I mean, I think Nicole was going to answer. I think Nicole was going to answer.
I think it's pointless as expecting any mayor who has, they are political members of political parties, to have someone who's not a member of a political party who is opinionated, and let's face it, all of the LBC journalists are really opinionated. Nick Ferrari is completely opinionated. James O'Brien's completely opinionated. Their opinions might be different from each other, but they are independent of the Assembly and of political parties.
So if I could just bring it back, Assembly Cooper, please. That being the question to Nicole is, how is independence defined? And that may well be the answer, but if we could ask that of the officer, not members.
That is the answer, yes. Yes.
Which I figured you may provide, but thank you. Assembly Member Fortune.
Just quickly then, and then it's always worth checking your emails during these meetings, because I see a press release is sort of slipping out about that, we're confirming James O'Brien. It's embargoed, actually, but you said it first. So I think perhaps what might be helpful is if we take out the word independent, because I think to the public, they would assume that it was an independent panel, as you would look in the
Absolutely.
The public sector.
Noted.
So we can say there's somebody been chosen to host.
I will take that away. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are at the end of that discussion. Hopefully, let's see. Hopefully. Brilliant. Okay, with all that being said, the committee is recommended to note the proposals for the State of London debate as a hybrid event from Indigo at the O2 on the 29th of June 2023 and provide any ideas or suggestions on further ways to improve the State of London debate as a consultative event. I think we have done that somewhat.
Not for this event, though, which we were being consulted about, as you've just said. The press release has just come out.
I think actually makes a very good point, actually, that we have been asked to note proposals and provide ideas on the State of London debate for this time, yet the press release is already...
Well, just to be clear, it's an op note, so it's for planning purposes, so I did say that. So it's not been released yet.
Yes.
But it's been written.
It's been written. It's just a... So you are going to take away all this discussion. It's going to go into that embargoed press release, and there's going to be changes before it comes. Yeah.
The operational note just states the location and general topics and the host, and that was the update from today. But
that's everything.
I will definitely take away the comment here today and provide further information specifically about how we do these better in the future.
Thank you. Thank you. And Nicole, if you wanted to take leave, but again, the invitation to stay is always open. I'd like to welcome our guests who joined the Chief Officer for this discussion. We've got Alex Conway, the Deputy Greater London Returning Officer, Leah Goddard, Senior Election Programme Manager, and AJ Patel, Senior Project Manager. I wonder if perhaps, because this is an ongoing item, if there's anything, Mary, that you want to add before discussion?
I don't think so, Chairman. It's one of our regular updates to this committee.
Thanks, Assembly Member Deval. Did you still want to?
Yeah, I mean,
just Mike.
Could you just tell us a brief update around where we are on the budget and the package of measures that we are be informing Londoners around ID issues, how that's going to relate back to any government information that may be relayed, as well as about the arrangements for the elections, but people probably don't really know about the first past the post issue of the mayoral vote. So what's the plan for that, and what's the package? Can you give us an idea of what that is, or what it looks like at the moment?
Yeah, well, as you say, Assembly Member Duval, there are several changes that we are going to have to deal with as administrators of the election, but also educate, as far as we can, Londoners about. And as ever, the Electoral Commission will be doing some of that nationally, and we will be doing some of that regionally. So, Alex, do you want to talk a little bit more about that? And I think you're looking for a sense of the money and the budget that we're spending.
Sense of money and the budget. I could add in postal votes, letting people know about that and the availability and what they need to do.
So firstly, in the budget that was agreed as part of the City Hall process last year, I think we've got up to 450 grand, which is about in line with what we've had in sort of previous elections. In an ideal world there'd be more, but there's only so much. As it happens, we just had a discussion with the Electoral Commission yesterday where we talked about how we will kind of coordinate our works on things like voter ID. And there's an important point maybe just worth clarifying, and I know many Assembly members will of course be aware of this already, but the Mayor may have views on the Election Act and voter ID, and he may, and City Hall does work around that. That is wholly separate from the role of the Greater London Returning Officer and our role in providing kind of factual advice as to the sort of changes that are coming in. And as you say, there's a few points here. So one, again, it's useful to hear from the Electoral Commission yesterday that they're analysing how the elections went outside London earlier this month, and whether there may be any advice around sort of changes to the guidance that produced in light of that. So I think we'll keep a careful eye on that. There are elements of the Elections Act still to be introduced in relation to, as I say, things like postal votes. People need to, so we need to keep an eye on that. There are going to be changes scheduled in October, I think we were told, and in January. So I think we'll have to keep quite a live set of thoughts. We've just started off sort of thinking of, we've got the sort of common strategies that we've got from previous elections to sort of dust down and then think about how we need to change and reinforce it. So I think there's going to be a big emphasis on the changes around the Elections Act. Also, of course, the possibility of a combined general election and a mayoral election. And, we'll have to have comms prepared for how we'd be managing that as well. So all that work is in hand. As in the past, we'll be using, a mix of digital media, real life buses, posters, and so on. And we'll do the most we can with the money we've got to maximise impact and reach.
Sorry, that begs the question, the money that you've got, and given the inflation and where that is that budget the right level of budget? If we have a general election at the same time, I think that's fine, that will happen. If it's an election alone on its own, then we need to consider other issues. So what's the process for looking again at that budget? Is that something you decide, as in you've got the power to do that, or is that something that requires a mayoral direction to put more money into the budget? How does it work? Just remind me, I should know, but it's a long time.
It's part of the City Hall budget process. So,
right.
And so it will come up again next year. There are, for the reasons you've already given, Assemblymember Deval, there are going to be elements of the budget we're going to need to look at again. For example, we're in the midst at the moment of carrying out several, mentioned the paper procurements. Once we know the final cost of those procurements, then we'll be able to update the budget with what things actually cost. So as part of that, so we will be looking at it again in the next financial year.
So you'll be able to share with us a package of issues. Of course, I don't want to spend money that I don't have to. It's about how flexible can you be if A happens or B happens in that sense. Will you be able to share that package with us then of what can be done with the money and how that would, and what would be done with any extra monies if you were able to access them?
So I'd say a couple of things. Firstly, actually, Alex mentioned some procurement exercises that are now coming to an end, and they are listed in the paper. We already know, don't we, Lee, from some of those final returns that our costs are going to be higher than we had estimated. And of course they are in the current economic climate with inflation. And particularly, we're buying huge amounts of paper for ballot papers. We're buying huge amounts of printing. All of those have gone up in price. So we are already seeing an impact of that. And through the budget process, City Hall budget process, in Q1, we will be reporting that into the process and asking for more money. I think the question that you are posing that we need to take away and think about more is, of course, the marketing budget is also subject to the same inflationary pressures, and will be. We'll need to understand, what level of inflation, the type of activity that we would normally do has been subject to, because of course we do tend to work within the budget that we've got. Whereas if we're tendering for ballot papers, we get the budgets that people are asking for in the tender process. And so I think we do need to ask ourselves, to what extent has inflation eroded that budget, and what does that do to our ability to reach the Londoners we need to reach, particularly in probably a more complex world than we've probably ever had before in the GLA, given all the changes that we know are ahead. I mean, our borough colleagues, of course, will be doing their normal, really good work to raise awareness of some of these changes among their local electorate. So, we mustn't forget that all of that will be happening, and Lee will be working with them to make sure all of that is coordinated. But I think it's a very timely challenge that we should look again at that marketing budget and see if, as part of Alex said our reprofiling of the budget, we've already got to do what case there might be or not around the marketing budget. We can come back to the committee with that.
Thank you. Yes, we would like to see that, so thank you, Mary. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you. I was interested in looking at this, and obviously you're having to assume it could be the same day as the general, and that's your planning, and I absolutely get that. Greater number of ballot papers, all that, absolutely. And you've got in the appendix, you've got where the counts will be. So you're assuming if next May turns out to be the general election as well, for example, let me pick here, Barnet and Camden, all the parliamentary seats, as well as the GLA ballot papers, will be counted at Alexandra Palace. No. Can you just explain that to me then, because I've misunderstood that. And I also wanted to understand, this is not going to be a digital count. The benefits we have seen of the digital counts are that we had ward breakdowns for each of the ballot papers, and then you can put that into borough. Are we going to still be able to have ward and borough breakdowns? And obviously, if two counts are going on, general elections counted in one way and ours a different way, it's very complex. Can you just talk me through it a bit more, please?
So I'm going to ask Lee to come into the detail on that, but this is a really important point on Appendix B, and we do not want to set any hairs running.
Well, I saw that and thought, my goodness.
So, no, the title of this table is GLA count locations.
Yes.
So because we're having to plan primarily for a combined election, for all the reasons you say, Assembly Member Pigeon, we cannot get caught short by a general election being called for May. We start with the premise, of course, that parliamentary elections are always counted locally. Many of them, of course, within the constituency themselves. And that is the starting point for this. The question then is, and so if you look at Bexley and Bromley, for example, which is the one below Barnet and Camden, you can see the two more local centres, and that is because Barnet and Camden will count, in the event of a combined election, will count their parliamentary counts at a very local level. We can't see where on this table. But when it comes to the GLA, mayoral and assembly counts, they will move to Alexandra Palace.
Okay, but the verification then is going to have to take place at the very local ones. Right, so that's, I did read this at pace when it came through on Friday.
So you're right. So actually, for verification purposes, we should probably have those local, ultimately, we will need to be issuing the local venues as well.
Because sometimes, even though you try not to, ballots get muddled, all that. So you've got verification locally, they'll then be kept in the ward, the polling district boxes. They'll go to the bigger venues. So I saw, Oval Cricket Ground. I thought that might be nice for trip out, go to the Oval and to look at a count. But actually then you'll be counting them, and will they be in ward?
So I'll come back to Lee for that question.
Wards.
But that's exactly right. But not everybody has the venues locally that allows them to come together at assembly constituency level for the count. So they do in Barnet and Camden because they have Alexandra Palace. They do in Brent and Harrow because they have Wembley Arena. Croydon and Sutton, Bexley and Bromley, they're saying very clearly to us, no, we don't have a constituency level venue. And so I'm saying, OK, I accept that. I can't do anything about that because of the point you say, all the verification has got to happen at local level. So the count landscape will be quite dispersed and a bit of a mix, as you can see here. But even, and this is the really important point I want to get across, that this landscape will be the landscape even if it's a standalone GLA election.
But standalone, all the ballots will go to Alexandra Palace or wherever, no?
They will for Barnet and Camden, but not for Bexley and Bromley.
Yes, exactly. OK. And then the other complexity in there is so many parliamentary seats are now cross-borough. So you might have Lambeth and Southwark, but as Len will know, there's various seats if they go through, bits of Lewisham, bits of Southwark.
And that's, again, what we are assuming.
I'm just thinking there's going to be ballot boxes floating around London, goodness knows where.
Exactly.
I mean,
it's going
really
to be very tricky.
Difficult, isn't it?
Very tricky, which is why we've had to plan primarily for that scenario.
So, Lee, can you clarify about this ward count results, please, and so on?
Yes, so the goal is that we replicate the information that's been available for past elections, but as you'll understand, as it's the first time we've done a manual count, we're in conversations with the boroughs to ensure that they can produce that information. We're looking to ensure that there's a consistent approach, regardless of where the count is that we, for our own sakes as well, we get the information as we want it. Generic forms are produced and so forth. So the goal is to replicate what we've done in the past. But to stress, at the moment, we are having embryonic conversations with the boroughs to make sure they can do what we want them to do. And if need be, we will direct when we want certain bits of information.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you. I want to go back to the communications strategies, and Alex, you talked about dusting down old plans. Now, I think before 2016 or up to 2016, there used to be quite a lot of marketing about the Assembly election, what it means, what the Assembly's for, you know, how the election works, that you're electing Assembly members, you're electing a mayor, how the ballot papers work, so that people know what to expect and they know the difference between the proportional part of the election and the part where constituency members are being elected. And then obviously the mayor count is a simpler count now that we've had first past the post imposed on it. But so I'm just, I think in the last election, there wasn't so much of that kind of information out there. Whether that contributed to the confusion around the way the mayor ballot worked out and whether that added to people's confusion about it, I don't know. But I do think it's really important that there is proper communication about what the Assembly is, what our role is, and the fact that there are two separate election processes and that people should expect two votes in relation to electing their Assembly members. And so I just wondered if that's part of your thinking.
I think absolutely, and just to say, it's worth saying, I've been doing this role since 2017. I remember some of our initial conversations in the pre-COVID world were very much about ensuring that the Assembly ballot papers were explained as well as the mayoral, not least because each one has a different approach and the mayor had two votes. I think probably worth saying, because of COVID, I think there's probably no getting round the fact that, in truth, the comms around the 2021 election were mostly around, voting safely at your polling station, and that's where everything went. I think had it not been for COVID, you probably would have seen exactly the kind of work that you're talking about, Assembly Member Russell. And I think for 2024, it's incumbent on us to make sure that's all in there. And as you say, there's a the message we definitely need to get across about the second preference vote not being there anymore. Actually, it means that you've got one ballot paper, you've got 3 ballot papers, and each ballot paper has 1 vote. That's quite a simple message that we can get across, and will hopefully allow us to emphasise that assembly role a bit more.
It's also, I mean, there's another piece which is about what the fact that we're there to keep to check the mayor's doing a good job, and I think a lot of Londoners don't but to check whether he's doing a good job, but I think a lot of Londoners don't really understand that. They don't know much about their local council either, but it's there is a piece of work to explain what the Assembly does.
Well, and we did have, and something I should emphasise, and again, of course, you'll recall this, we are required to produce a statutory booklet that goes to not just every household, but every voter. Again, I think we've got some wording, and again, we'll do this again to make sure that adequately reflects how the mayor and the Assembly works. There's a good few pages. Now, how many voters read that booklet? That's another question. But the information is all there, and it does go to every voter.
Thank you, Assembly Member Fortune.
Thank you. I shall be brief. I want to stay on the marketing theme, and Alex, this is probably not so much about you because you're going to be producing that statutory marketing, which I think is one thing. But the stuff that's coming out of the GLA. So, Lee, this is maybe for you. Who controls that budget?
Well, ultimately, it's the budget of the Greater London Returning Officer, who is me.
Right. Okay.
And in the authority, the Greater London Authority, needs to provide me with the resources that I need to run the election.
Okay. So, understanding that, what we can be guaranteed with is objective marketing distributed fairly, right? Is there a separate mayor's budget for marketing around informing people about the way that the elections work?
No. Okay. Well, no.
Right. Because what I'm interested in, because it's modern...
other than the money on voter ID, which Alex has already referred to.
Okay. Because what I'm interested in here is not necessarily the spend, but the targeting. So something we saw with because TfL did the consultation on ULEZ, and the public wrote back and said, no, we don't want this, go away. So there was another YouGov poll commissioned, and when we dug into that, it was very targeted. So it was targeted towards certain demographics, age groups, geographical areas, stuff like that. What we want to be very mindful of in terms of any information marketing going out is some report landing on an officer's desk saying, do you know what, we need to target X demographic. So there is specific targeting sent to certain areas, which I think could cause political concern. So what oversight can we as members have on what marketing is planned to go out? And what I'm really interested in, again, is the targeting of said marketing and why.
Well, so I think ultimately the responsibility for making sure that the money is spent objectively and fairly to inform electors of London about the GLA elections, that is my responsibility as Greater London Returning Officer, and I do not report to the Mayor or the Assembly in that role. That's a role that I am contracted to do separately. And if somebody wants to challenge the decisions that I have made in this role, they petition to take me to court. So that's it's a different role. I although I am chief officer, I don't do this.
And that's why I was separating it out.
Separately contracted to do this role for the GLA. So that's the first thing, and I protect my independence in that extremely carefully. We last time in 2021 we set out ultimately approved by me, a brief for the company that helped us with the marketing planning about what we wanted to achieve, which was, and I forget the exact words, but a broad reach of Londoners to build awareness of the elections. And so, in fact, it was the opposite of targeting.
Yeah.
And that will be the brief that we put in again. To Assemblymember Duval's point, we'll have to find out what we can afford with the budget that we've currently got.
So that's the question of control. You know, you're talking to an old newspaper man here. I remember when we were recruiting for the office and we weren't getting anybody, and we asked the question, where's the advert gone out? And they said, The Guardian. And we went, that might be the issue in terms of recruiting for the Conservative office. So you can see a paper that says, do you know what, there's a demographic that, let's take younger people. There's a demographic that's really not engaged with politics, so we're going to do something on Facebook targeted at under 20s to make sure that they get out. You could make an argument that is targeting a demographic and that there's a political, there's a political slant to that. So if we see something that is, purporting to educate people on going out to vote, purporting to educate people on the mayoral elections, and we have some concerns with it, or anybody has any concerns with it, who do we take it to say, where did this come from?
You bring it to me as the Greater London Returning Officer.
And there's no separate budget for the Mayor's office to do anything like that?
Well, apart from the voter ID, you need to talk to that. Okay. Alex was already referred to, as we know. In fact, Assemblymember Hall has momentarily left. But as we know, there is a budget around building people's awareness of the need for the voter ID. That is the Mayor's budget. There was an MD on it just very recently. Yeah. That is the only budget I know of, but that, as Alex said at the beginning, is entirely separate from the work of this team.
It would be pretty impossible, actually, to do any digital advertising without putting in demographics that you want to hit. You can't.
Well, any advertising, full stop. But that's why. But we went for a reach that reflects the population of London.
Yeah, sorry.
That's
Alex,
how we want to spend our money.
Yeah. And sorry, I think to answer your question, Assemblymember Fortune, I mean, it's the Communities and Social Policy team, totally separate team that manages the whole voter awareness sort of idea. That budget. They will know. Well, I'm and again, we consciously sort of stay at an arm's length from it. But I have no doubt that colleagues in that team. It's led by Dr. Pop, isn't it? Could provide.
Dr. Who, sorry?
Dr. Elizabeth Pop, I think, leads the some of that work within Tom Rahilly's team.
Yes, but members of this committee have challenged some of the officers on that already because it came up through the Budget and Performance Committee last year, and again I think there was a challenge about how are you using that money? Who are you judging to be needing to be informed, somehow not getting the messages about voter ID, and how is that going to link in with the work of the Electoral Commission? So the last conversation I remember about that was through Budget and Performance Committee. As Alex says, that is sort of Tom Rahilly, Tunde's, Oli Inca's team, working on that entirely separate from us. I mean, I cannot have anything and do not have anything to do with it, nor does this team. Okay. But if the committee wants to talk to that team, I'm sure that's the team that you should call.
So Lee as well, so you don't have anything to do. So the Community Social Policy team, they're working out, right, these are the people we want to get in touch with. And then that comes to you, Lee, as programme manager to develop.
No. The two are in totally separate. So the team you have in front of you are the London Elects team, which is the branding for the team that runs the GLA elections. And in effect, Lee, Alex and AJ, in simple terms, and a couple of others, are directly appointed by me to support me on the GLA mayoral and assembly elections. Right, well, that's all this team, that's all that AJ does, it's all that Lee does. Alex and I have other jobs, but we have time dedicated to this.
So with that, I won't labour the point, if you excuse the pun, but if you could swap hats then. So can we see any sort of marketing methodology or targeting plans or anything like that for literature going out from any part of the organisation that is, and how it's targeted? Can we understand how and why it's targeted and why it's aimed at certain demographics and on which channels?
So if you want to understand that for the Mayor's work on voter ID, you need a different team in front of you. But certainly we can ask that team for it. So if that's an action you want me to do, but I can't do it I can do it only with my other hat on. That's right. Yeah, okay. We can do that. I have to say, as the Greater London Returning Officer, I don't feel it's appropriate, you may not want to hear this, for me to discuss with you my marketing campaign for the GLA elections, partly because some of you will be candidates, and other candidates don't get afforded that insight. Once we have planned that campaign, I am more than happy to share the committee the brief to the planning company and where we've ended up broadly. But I really can't then enter into a negotiation around that.
So my questions were all based on the way that YouGov survey was designed specifically around ULEZ, and it was specifically targeted to certain demographics, and that's my concern. But I'll stop it there.
I think so. I think if we take that as an item, and your last response there, Mary, I think from what Assembly Member Duval was saying, Assembly Member Fortune was saying earlier, there may well be some interest in seeing some more about the marketing campaign, perhaps what the budget has afforded, and then perhaps the methodology. But I understand taking that point, that would be a document almost taken as read, because I completely take the point that perhaps we shouldn't be, as Assembly members starting to negotiate with you where we think there should be marketing. But I think taking on both those points is probably a document that this committee would like to see.
Yes, yes, Chairman. I understand there's two. I'm happy to take the action on the voter ID work, but it's for another team.
No, I understand. I'm saying, so if we could just take that back, that I think there's a report that needs to perhaps be seen that shows us around what the marketing budget has been able to afford and how that's been deployed, and also the methodology behind it. That is the action to take away from there. With that in mind, the committee's recommended to note the work being undertaken to prepare for the GLA elections 2024. Thank you. And hopefully let's get Rebecca in, running in, hopefully. And if anyone that wanted to leave can leave or stay. Unless you're a member of this committee. Unfortunately, you're not afforded that same hospitality. I don't. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I mean, pull straws for 2 people that want to go, if you like. No. We're almost there. We're on the final stretch. Well, the first committee meeting of the oversight I chaired was the shortest meeting I've ever been on, and this is now the longest meeting I've ever been on. Hopefully, we'll find a happy medium next time.
It's a hard meeting, I think, to get it finished in time before 5 p.m.
Yeah. Okay, moving on to consultation on shared services proposal, provision of committee services to MOPAC. I take this as read by members. Rebecca, if there was anything urgent you felt needed adding, then...
There's nothing to add, Chairman, but I'm very happy to answer any questions that members may have.
There are no questions from members. So, can I ask the committee to note, prior to any decision by the Mayor under Section 401A of the GLA Act 1999, as amended, the proposed establishment of administrative arrangements for the discharge by the GLA of the relevant part of the MOPAC Committee Services Secretariat function, and provide comments on these proposals? Noted. Noted. Members. Thanks so much for staying, Rebecca. Yeah. And you may also take up a leave as well. Thanks. GLA Oversight Committee work programme. Obviously, we discussed earlier that our June meeting will potentially be on a business trips investigation, which will scope out with group leads. Can I ask the committee to note the work programme, though, in front of you, which is fairly TBC, and meeting dates as agreed at the London Assembly annual meeting on the 4th of May 2023. Date of next meeting, which will hopefully be slightly shorter, but maybe not much. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled to take place on Tuesday, the 20th of June at 10 a.m. in the Chamber City Hall. And any other business? There is no any other business, urgent business.